premium account for on Twitter is required to broadcast. Okay. All right. So let me change that actually. That's a bummer. So let me go remove. Okay. And I'll add this one back. Save changes. Okay, great. Now, oh, okay. We are live. We are officially live on the stream. Okay, great.
Good.
All right. So I guess there were some issues that we're having. So, but it seems like people are able to see us and hear us. So, hi everybody. Hi, Zara. Thanks very much. And glad you like the avatar. And hello also to Dr. Kurt. Dr. Kurt's a really fantastic interlocutor and has really strong arguments and has written a lot. And hello also to Voyage Apologetics. I've seen Voyage do some live streams too, and really fantastic. And Faith from Facts is here too, so that's great. This is a great meeting of the mind then. All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm really glad that you all are here with us. Yeah, that's muted, just making sure. Okay, great. And we're talking with Brooklyn Lou today. Now, the first thing I want to tell you all is Brooklyn Lou has a fantastic channel and also a really great community. And in terms of like people who are willing to talk through their own echo bubbles and reach out to other communities, I think nobody does it better than Brooklyn Lou. His personality as a persona on YouTube is really disarming and very charming. And in addition to that, he has very cogent and very persuasive arguments. So we're going to try and talk through my perspective and Brooklyn Lou's worldview. And but I would recommend, if you haven't already, please click the like button on this video. That does help both of our channels out. And if you haven't already, while you're listening to this, go to Brooklyn Lou's channel. It's really fantastic. And click like to give him a like and subscribe to his channel as well. So yeah, thanks. Well, Brooklyn Lou, let me turn it over to you for an introduction, and you can ask me for more introductory information, or we can get right into asking each other questions. And this is going to be a bit of a discussion, but I think somewhere between discussion, conversation, debate, and hopefully overlapping portions of that whole Venn diagram. But thanks for being here, Brooklyn Lou.
Thank you, Tavo. And I really appreciate what you're doing. And I appreciate your channel. I've seen you around for a while. You have a great channel. So looking forward to it. The main thrust of what I do is I come at things from an atheist perspective, skeptical about religion, of course. But I also want to always encourage open dialogue about these things, because I think it's very important. And it's also always very important to keep arguments about religion and philosophy, et cetera, not on a personal level. I mean, I love Christian people, so so I don't want to come across as someone who dislikes Christian people. Most of the people in my world are Christian, right? But of course, I'm atheist, so let's go, Tavo.
Well, I think you're doing a great job of it. I think you're very respectful with everyone who calls into your channel. You're very respectful whenever you do any chats with people. And yet your perspective is something I appreciate. You don't get like super into like very esoteric philosophical arguments. You keep everything really grounded. I think that's always like really appreciated on my end. And I have a slightly more nuanced take. So I'm eager to get into some of the stuff that you do. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey, first of all? I think my recollection is you were not an atheist for all your life. You started off Christian. You became an atheist. I want to say fairly recently, too.
No, not recently, but I'll explain. All right, I was born into Catholicism. You know, I was baptized Catholic when I was a baby, and that's where I got my early introduction to the Christian God and Christianity. I went to catechism and first Holy Communion and confirmation, you know, which is all part of, you know, the Catholic Church. And I believed in God pretty much my whole life. But when I was in my 20s, I had like a radical type conversion into more fundamentalist born again Christianity. And I spent most of my life there. And about 13, 14 years ago or so, I changed my mind after studying for about 3 years privately. You know, I'm not educated, by the way. You know, I'm self-educated, you know, and I found my way out of the faith that I had most of my life. So.
Kurganelli says, "You're still a baby, Brooklyn Lou. Age is just a number."
Yeah. I'm 63 now, and most of my life I was a Christian.
And I didn't know how old you are, actually, and you seem very young at heart. And maybe it's the hipness or the style. Don't know what it is, but anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, what made you say? What if was there a moment, or was it a set of beliefs that made you say, I'm not down with this anymore?
It certainly wasn't one moment. As I recall it, it was about 3 years of studying and trying to learn more about the faith that I had, and looking at it very critically. You know, most of my life, I didn't really look at things that critically. I would just accept it and believed it. You know, I put my whole life into Jesus. So I was one of those. I wasn't like a casual Christian. When I got older, when I was in my mid-20s onward, I took it very, very serious. But I guess life sometimes changes, and I started really researching, and I started doubting some of the things that I always thought were true. Started with evolution. I was a Bible Christian, so I really took the Bible as the Word of God, and it was inerrant. And I started to realize after I studied evolution that, yeah, I could say that this was indeed true. And therefore, the Adam and Eve story was immediately, put into question. So I stopped believing in a literal Adam and Eve. And from there, it was the canon, how the Bible was put together. And I started seeing it as a book that was written by men and put together by men. And that changed my outlook as well, because it starts, I guess you start wondering, well, if it was put together by men, how much can I say is absolutely accurate? So that was how I started leaving Christianity,
Yeah, and by the way, there's 2 instructions for the audience that I have. Number one, other than liking and supporting both of our channels, if you're inclined. Number one, feel free to ask questions in the comment section, and if there are questions for myself or Brooklyn Lou, I'll put those on the screen. You can make observations or questions, and while we're chatting, I'm going to highlight comments from people who comment. Thanks there, Grace. 11 watching, 7 likes. Please remember to hit the like button. Always good advice. I really appreciate that, and thank you for bringing that up as well. All right, so let's get into the meat. Oh, and the other thing that I want to say to the audience and to Brooklyn Lou is there is a small chance. I have a close friend who's in the hospital, so there's a small chance that I will either have to get called away for the short term, or and it may just be for a few seconds, or it may be for the duration. I kind of hope that doesn't happen, but I wanted to keep this going. But if that happens, I do apologize in advance. All right, so let's get into sort of the meat and potatoes. Do you want to ask me some questions? Do you want to say, here are my doubts, here's what I'm bringing to the table as an argument against Christianity, what do you think of this stuff? And I already have things that I could react to in the things that you said. We're of course going to keep this very civil and conversational, so this is going to be a bit of a back and forth, no time statements, but I'd love if you wanted to say, yeah, so here are my reasons for doubting, so what do you think about those? I'm happy to answer those as they come up.
Well, if you don't mind, Tavo, I'm curious myself, since I've been, watching you and you've engaged with me a couple of times. One thing I didn't know that I'm just personally curious to know is, how did you find your way out of atheism? Because you've said you were an atheist. And how did you find your way into Christianity? I've always been curious about that.
Yeah, I probably became an atheist at around 9 or 10 years old, and it was really it was really because I was raised in a very austere orthodoxy. But after leaving religion, I did come to like you see it as a man-made construct, and I was an atheist for several decades. And then I would say maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I became more agnostic. And I wrote a book that I put out anonymously called Everything I Know About the Universe. And it was not really any set of theological answers. It was really more questions that I had about the universe that I think are unresolved paradoxes. And I stopped asking, is there a God? And I started asking the question, does the universe have a purpose? And I concluded that it's more likely than not that our universe, our existence is on some level, in some way purposeful. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's a rational mind, but that's kind of what I came to. And then I started sort of looking into religions, and I was actually I started studying the New Testament, or reading it anyways, from the perspective of a mythicist. So to me, Jesus was a folk hero who never really existed, and I started saying, well, this folk hero is a pretty good teacher, and he seems to at least be smarter than some of the people who are writing the books. Meaning that when I read Mark, it's written in a very simplistic way, and Mark, there's a lot of paradoxes in Mark about that are literary. There's a lot of very interesting literary elements. So I started saying it's interesting that the literary figure here seems to be smarter than the author. Now I've written some fictional books as well, so I know that's kind of a hard thing to do. So and then and by the way, between being an atheist and an agnostic, and deciding that I have at least a fondness, or I don't know if you'd say proclivity, towards the teachings of Jesus, I went through a lot of other religious works. I read the Guru Granth Sahib of Sikhism, really beautiful book. I read the Kitab-i Aqdas of Baha'i, also very beautiful book. I, of course, have read the Quran several times. Um, and I read the Book of Mormon, the LDS, just because there were enough Mormons around me who were putting it in front of my face that I was like, least I can do is read it.
Yeah.
And I think there's actually some good things about in that book that I like in some ways. Yeah, but yeah. So but none of those books really created the same sense of, wow, this person is a really good teacher, as the teachings of Jesus. So I started getting into those teachings, and I encountered a huge intellectual tradition of people who are atheists, but constructively and directly cite Jesus. People like Ludwig Wittgenstein, and John von Neumann, and Jürgen Habermas, and Hannah Arendt. Now, John von Neumann was not an atheist, but I think the rest of those names are people who were indeed atheists, who just said, "Here's a really great teaching of Jesus that I'm going to expropriate and build my contributions to the human intellectual history on top of those." So yeah, so that's kind of why I started getting into and it's, Zara says Quran. Yeah, I understand that reaction. And by the way, that was my reaction from a very, very early age. And I wouldn't say that I've come around to like saying, "Oh, this is a great book that everybody should read," but I now have more respect for it than I did as a child. I think I respect it for its cultural legacy. I think I have more respect for Muhammad in some ways than I did as a child. But I understand the reaction, and I don't disagree with that.
So, do you consider yourself a particular denomination of Christian? Like, do you feel you're born again, like the Bible would say? Or is it a certain type of Christianity that you more align yourself with?
Yeah, I'm definitely not theologically committed. Um, I'm definitely still exploring. I've not I don't have any denomination that I would say this is the one for me. Um, just to underscore this point, Dr. Kurt asked a really good point. Loads of people think Frodo Baggins was very wise. How does that matter? I think and I think people cite Tolkien in some intellectual traditions. So Tolkien definitely contributed to the intellectual legacy of humanity. I think if I thought that Frodo Baggins was much wiser than Tolkien, then we would have a bit of a paradox. But again, when I say that Jesus was wise or had really good teachings, my point is not that, everyone should therefore follow Jesus right away. I mean, I've made other videos that go down that road. But I think for purposes of where I'm saying that I was at this point in my life, my standpoint was there are some good teachings here. These are interesting and good teachings, and they're impactful in terms of the way that I live my life. Yeah, I'm not really theologically committed, even much less having decided on a denomination. But maybe someday I will. I really love the position that I'm in now because I feel like I've got this whole intellectual history of Christianity in front of me, and I'm just getting into it. So I'm not very far in my journey, and I think that uncertainty gives you a nice perspective in terms of it's like looking out over a really vast empty field, you know. And I've met a lot of people on both sides of the theological spectrum who say, I know God, I know the purpose of the universe, I know what's going to happen to me after I die. And and the people who are Christian, people who are very atheist, who have that very high degree of certainty. To me, it's almost more exciting and more enriching to say, yeah, I don't know. And many Christians, many atheists will ask me questions, and I'll say, that's a good question. I don't know that. I don't know the answer. And there's some questions that are the traditional apologetical line, and I say, I don't agree with that. So, like, just to give you some example, we talked a little bit about literalism and biblical inerrancy. What I love to point out to people, or we'll probably get to that later, but the great question. And like I want to make this more of a conversation, so I don't want to prattle on for too long.
Yeah. So you want like a difficult question that I have that I'd love you to answer, or I would pose to any Christian, really. You want me to give you a difficult one?
Sure. Maybe like start off with a softball and work up to the difficult ones, but feel free. Yeah, wherever you want to go with this.
No, and this is to me a very difficult one. So I'm going to start with a difficult one. All right. And it's something that I think cuts to some of the philosophy that's behind, Christian thinking. And that's, do you feel that there's any evidence that can prove Christianity false? Right? Not prove it, but the opposite. I'm getting into falsifiability of something. So do you find that there's any evidence that can prove Christianity false? And why hasn't God provided that? Because in my way of thinking, falsifiability is very important when we're trying to discern what is true. All right. To me, if something is not falsifiable, it would be a belief, right? Which is fine. I mean, I absolutely think that's perfectly logical to have a belief. But most of the Christians I meet will tell me, no, Christianity is absolutely true. So my question kind of cuts through that. And I'm wondering, do you think that Christianity is actually falsifiable?
Yeah, I mean, I think my theological take on Christianity is falsifiable. I think if I could parse your question out in one of two ways. One way is you could say, what evidence would you need to realize that you're wrong and change your mind, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
And I think if my answer to that is there's no evidence in the world that you could show me that would ever make me change my mind, I think that's a problem. If you're if you're that closed-minded that nothing could disprove your beliefs, then I think you're in a position where, and so I do think we're finding out new evidence. The Herculaneum, there's this library that I'm just starting to get involved with as a citizen researcher. So these, they're actually looking for people with medical imaging physics in their intellectual background who can tackle some of these questions around these transcripts. So I think we are maybe there's a lot of ancient knowledge from the ancient world that hasn't been preserved, and there's some ancient knowledge that that we're finding that's new. I mean, the Nag Hammadi library, all those Nag Hammadi codices are are only discovered really in human history of a very recent time ago, right? So I think it's conceivable that we'll discover something that could prove that another religion is more true. Like, let me give you an example. In the Quran, Muhammad splits the moon or whatever. That's often said. And actually, this doesn't say that in the Quran. It says that the moon was split during the reign of Muhammad, and people interpreted that to be a sign of his divine rulership. That'd be kind of like me seeing a lunar eclipse or seeing other weird atmospheric phenomena and saying, "Oh, because of this, because I've seen this, Donald Trump should be the president. That's a divine sign of his rulership." And so, let me tell you that if I saw documentation that said, Muhammad, I'm a neutral observer. Muhammad did this spell and the moon automatically split. That's something that I think would be very persuasive. I don't think we're very likely to find that, but that's just one example. I'm going to make.
You're not locked in. Like,
yeah,
you consider yourself open-minded.
Yeah, right? And oh, great. Okay, and by the way, LA Apologetics is here as well, and I'm just going to highlight them because they're actually a mod on this chat. So for whatever reason, if anyone, if you want to tag him, if there's like a link you want to share or something important, they're a mod on this channel, so feel free to share with them. So yeah, I think my views are falsifiable. I could change my mind.
That's very good to me, because that means, it just simply means you're open-minded to me. But I'm sure a lot of Christians don't offer that, right? You're a little bit different than a lot of different other types of Christians, right?
Well, I mean, I think that if somebody says there's no evidence that would convince me, I think there's a portion of that population that really no evidence would convince them. There's a portion of that population, but that's not really what they mean. That if you gave them like a stack of really hard evidence, I think they would consider it, and that would impact their theology. I really do think.
What would be that type of evidence? Like, what would it be? That's what I'm curious.
I think for some people, there's no threshold, right? Some people will say there's no threshold. I'll never change my mind. But, to give you an example, like I know somebody who literally hears the voice of Jesus, and they feel like they have communion with God, and they've had that subjective experience with God. I think for people who are in that camp, who really have a subjective firsthand knowledge of God, that's probably a degree that nothing would really shake their faith. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, I respect those people. I think there's a role for subjective experience and subjective evidence. But I think there are people who say nothing would change my mind, but if you did show them the evidence, they actually would change their mind. I mean, I've been proven wrong several times on this channel. So, I go back and forth on some things. So.
Well, by the way, I think that it's a wonderful thing to be proven wrong.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, I like to be proven wrong, because I'm not scared to change my view, right? If I was so locked in that I couldn't change my understanding, I wouldn't feel good about myself. But that's just me,
Yeah.
I want to be able, if something is said and I'm wrong, I like to say, I was wrong on that.
Well, somebody asked me this about the resurrection recently. They said, what if somebody from the LDS church showed up at your door tomorrow and said, here's a mountain of physical hard evidence that Joseph Smith resurrected, right? Would that convince me to switch to sign up for the LDS church? And in some ways, maybe this is an exceptionally high threshold, but that would not convince me. And the reason why is because I've already read the Book of Mormon. There are things I like about it and things that I don't like. And I don't think my perspective would be changed. But that's because I have, personal subjective moral preferences. So I think a lot of the apologetics conversation really zooms in on historical evidence too much. And I'm guilty of that myself. I think that's a really good thing to do from an objective standpoint. but it's also important to agree that it's not just objective criteria. I like Thomas Aquinas's 5 ways of knowing. He talks about how we know as individuals, we know through proof, and there's historical evidence, and there's biblical evidence. I think that's a persuasive argument to me, that if you're going to change your theology, it should really be multifactorial. And by the way, I'm not a priest. I'm not a minister. I have no congregation. I have no Patreon. There's no way to support me for anything. So you can't. Some people want to give me money. They can't. I just say, if you want to support me, go out into the world and do something nice for someone. But so no one should take anything that I say as talking for any denomination or talking for any specific viewpoint of theology. I always encourage people to find their own way, and I'm sharing my insights, and I'm sharing the evidence and the information that I found along the way. But none of this is helpful for other people outside of me, unless it is. And if it does resonate with some of you, I'm so glad. But you shouldn't. I would hate if anyone changed their viewpoints based on an opinion that I've shared. I really feel like it has to be both subjective and objective when you make a decision like that.
And I that's why I love you, Tavo, because to me that's very reasonable.
Oh, we do have a good question from Satyam. What does Lou think of these 4 arguments? Atheism, roots, and logical fallacies. 1, life proceeds from non-life. 2, morals stem from immorality. 3, chaos creates order. 4, rationality stems from irrationality. And by the way, this conversation is going to be more you putting me on the hot seat. But
no, it could swing any way. I'm cool.
Okay.
I don't mind.
You're a great interlocutor, and you're a great person to converse with. So I hope you'll stress test some of my beliefs. But if you want, you can answer this question to whatever degree.
It's 4 questions in one, right?
4 questions in one. That's So you can kind of pick and choose or answer part of the question or whatever you'd like to.
Okay, life proceeds from non-life. Let's go with number 1, right?
Sure.
I do believe it is true. Biogenesis is true. Life comes from life, right? So I would never argue that. I think that's absolute fact. Life comes from life. But there's another concept that is more theoretical, abiogenesis, right? And abiogenesis is how life may have formed from non-life, like chemical reactions, etc. And although I don't think that is a proven fact, I think it's definitely something that can be discussed. So when we're looking at a question like that, I don't take a position on exactly how life came into being. All right, it's beyond my knowledge, really. And I think it's probably beyond anyone's absolute knowledge at this point. So I leave it in an I don't know category. Not to try to avoid the question, but that's actually what I think. I mean, I really don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually there with you. I think that there's, I'll give you my stance on this point narrowly and then more broadly in terms of, is there a good workable mechanism for abiogenesis? Which is the word for life starting from non-life. There isn't. So we currently don't have every step of that process worked out, but that doesn't mean that we won't work it out someday, right? So, but I tend to think of how type questions as questions that should be in the domain of the sciences. How did this happen? That should be a scientific question, right? And it always should be. So we shouldn't stop by saying we don't understand how abiogenesis happens. We should always seek to fill in the blanks in the equation of how non-life turns into life. And I think filling in those blanks is intellectually nourishing and interesting. And we shouldn't think of that as a zero-sum game with our theology. To me, theology is meant to answer why-type questions. So, I think it's okay to say maybe God had something to do with life coming from non-life. But it's also okay to say, at the same time, we should still do research and we should still figure that out. And if we lose God as a mechanism, if we lose God as a causal explanation, that's okay, because theological questions are, to me, more broadly about, they're why type questions, and the scientific questions, which are mechanisms, are more how type questions. So I would never say that your theology should entirely rest on the fact that there is a gap in causality in our world or in the universe in general. And I think Zara actually points it out and says it really articulately. God gave us free will in our own mind, so we must use our brains and thoughts so we don't have blind faith. I actually would agree with that statement, right? I think it's bizarre and quite flawed to say, you know, that if God seems to want to make us thinking creatures, He seems to want us to think, right? So, and I sympathize with some of the things that you've said, Brooklyn Lou, because I feel like you've interacted with a lot of people who are like, "Don't ask questions. You shouldn't have any doubt, and you shouldn't have any questions." No, that's actually not the historical party line from Christianity. If you go back in history, there were people who were asking questions early on, the early church fathers, and they had many questions, and they didn't always have the answers, and they really relished the fact that they were asking questions. And I feel like it's the same way. If the answer is you're asking too many questions, then I feel like you're just in the wrong community. Now, I'll tell you from my personal standpoint, I've gone to churches and I've asked them questions. I said, how does this work? How does this happen? And they say, you must have no doubt, right? You must pummel the doubt, get rid of it from your mind. And I say, well, that's not really a great answer to me, right? Why would God make us with big brains that are constantly creating doubt and then say, well, now you have to turn your brain off to understand this? Now, I do at the same time sort of acknowledge that there are questions and answers that aren't purely discursively analytical, that can't be disaggregated into like their component parts. Ludwig Wittgenstein says there's like three questions. There's beauty, morality, and theology. And those are things that you can't always analyze your way in and out of the answers to those questions. I think that's a really good insight. I think it's an interesting insight. But I think if somebody tells you you have to turn off your brain to really understand this, then that's almost never the right answer.
Now, my experience is that when people do start questioning, right, and could be in any particular church. I've been in a lot of them, but a lot of times people may have questions, and the questions get very pointed, very sharp. My personal experience is many churches will really start to push that person outside, kind of like push them out of the congregation because they're looked at as being poison.
Yeah, and
I know that's not it's not a blanket thing, of course, right? But I do see that as something that happens in Christian churches.
Yeah, and I don't doubt that that's probably been your experience, and it's certainly the experiences of a lot of people that I've talked to, and it's certainly been my experience. I've walked into a lot of churches where I've had questions, and I was told, "This is not the right space for you," to be honest, right? And
there you go.
but that doesn't mean that all Christianity hinges upon you have to turn off your brain, right?
No,
That just means that this question is irritating to me.
yeah.
And sometimes it's the party line. They say, you got to stop asking questions if you want to get to know God. I think LA Apologetics brings up the let's bring this up. Let's see if I can find it again. Well, there was another comment that LA Apologetics put up about doubting Thomas. I think that's a good, right? Jesus isn't saying curse you, Thomas, right? He doesn't say to Thomas, get behind me, Satan. He says, you've seen the evidence, now follow me. Now, I think what's really beautiful about the New Testament is that, Jesus isn't like beating people over the head with his identity. He's saying, essentially, he's breaking the fourth wall. And he says, who do you say that I am? And I think there are some people like me that, if I were in first century Judea and I asked Jesus all my questions, he would be, you're going to get the sign of the fish, and that's it. That's all you're going to, or the sign of Jonah, and that's it. Right. I think that that's the way he interacts with some people, but he also interacts with people who are really coming at him from a standpoint of like, I believe, and then he does give those people a little more grace, but I don't think there's ever a condemnation of it's wrong to doubt. And I think the Bible even says explicitly, I can't remember which passage it is, but have mercy on those who doubt. I think you got to ask questions. And actually, what Christianity came from is a tradition that is extremely inquisitive, extremely argumentative, right? And like the Jews of the time in the first century were very keen debaters and very skeptical of their own viewpoints and other people's viewpoints, and they were always asking the questions. So I think the people who say no, you have to turn your brain off. That's I would go so far as to say that's probably the wrong response.
Now, as a follow up to that, you know that a lot of Christian theology and Christian theology, I know that you're aware, is diverse. There's different beliefs, different ideas, right? But in a lot of Christian theology, what you believe is the foundation of your salvation, right? I like to call it salvation by belief. You know, if you believe these things, you can be saved. If you don't believe these things, you will not be saved. And that's the type of Christianity that I'm well aware of, because that was where I spent most of my life. And I'm curious, like, what do you feel that it's a fair thing for a God to judge someone based on what they believe?
To some degree, yeah, right. Like if I believe that other people deserve to suffer, I think that's a belief that I could see God saying, that's not cool, and judging me on that. I don't think that would be flawed. But I see what you're saying, that in some degree this is a problem, and what you're pointing out is a real tension in not only the Christian literature and this, but also like really the scholarly literature about New Testament textual criticism. That there does seem to be this tension between, are we supposed to sell all our possessions and take up our cross and follow you and give up everything we have, or on the other hand, are we supposed to just believe and have faith and therefore everything's hunky-dory after that? Now, I think that is a legitimate, real tension. Now, the way that I think cuts through that tension is a lot of my theological journey for the first maybe 15 years of my life was really informed by my somewhat fractured relationship with my own parents, right? When I came to see the merits of the Christian teachings, I it really kind of changed my perspective on parenthood as an issue. And let me just explain it in a different way. I think you can melt away the tension between salvation by works versus salvation by belief by realizing that, and by realizing that there is a commonality between those two, and I think that does help to resolve that tension. Let me just give you the counterfactual to that, which I think is the Quran, like very cookbooky, right? God loves you, but He loves you if you do these things correctly. If you don't do these things, if you don't fill out the check marks and check the boxes, then God doesn't love you as much, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, Christianity isn't like that. It's not a cookbook of you have to do things, to be loved and do things to earn God's favor. Now, in some ways, think about it like you have a relationship. Let's say I meet somebody and I fall in love with them. We get married, right? Would I say to them, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get married, and then I'm going to give you all the instructions that I have for you in terms of like, how you can serve me well, right? And then I will judge you and give you love and reciprocate positive emotions to the degree to which you do these things correctly, right? That person would be like, you're a monster. There's no one who, right? But
Yes.
on the other hand, if I find somebody and I say, well, I love you very much, but I love you for who you are, and I want you to do these things for me, and I want to do these things for you, then it becomes a better relationship. So to me, if it's like when you raise a child, if that child has security in knowing that they're loved by their parents, it's not like they say, okay, great, I'm loved by my parents, now I can go do anything I want, and I know I'm not going to, like, I don't really even care what my parents want because I know they're going to love me anyways. That's not the way it works. The way it works is you say, I'm loved. That gives me the security and knowledge to know that I should be doing, I should be making the most of myself and doing everything I can to be a good child, or in some cases, a good partner. So that's what to me melts away that tension. I think if you really say I'm loved by God, then you're not going to. Now, this doesn't work for everybody, and certainly there's a degree of moral self-licensing that can really happen. But I think if you're like, God loves me, I'm secure in that, you're going to say, what can I do to be a person who is worthy of that love? and then you're going to try and do everything you can to be a good person and to not transgress any rules of morality.
Yeah, but isn't there an ultimate ending to all this? Like I'm picturing somebody who doesn't believe, right? Doesn't believe in Jesus, doesn't believe that, he died for their sins, doesn't believe they're a sinner. It could be that, right? They're just like, well, I'm happy with myself, right? Um, Ultimately, in Christian theology, at least common Christian theology, God is going to send that person into a punishment situation that's eternal. All right. So if that person doesn't believe a certain way, aren't they punished? I mean, am I missing something? Like once you go through down that road, you say, no, I don't believe in God. I don't have a good enough reason to believe in God. All right. At the end of all that, when you're sitting on the judgment of God, doesn't he say, oh, well, you don't believe in me, you can suffer?
Yeah, well, you're touching on several issues there. One is the issue of non-resistant non-belief, but I think first of all, let me just do a little bit of homework. TNC Apologetics made a short LA Apologetics. If you want to like copy and paste that link, because I think actually, let me see. Maybe I can make TNC a mod. Let me do that. If I can, then TNC, you should be able to share a link. Yeah, there we go. Oh no, okay, no, TNC, you're able to share that link. Yeah, people should definitely go check it out. I mean, preferably after this chat. But TNC's got a really, really fantastic channel, and I hope that people will check out his channel as well. And we did a really long live stream yesterday that was really wonderful. So yeah, all right. Now getting back to your question, Brooklyn Lou. Yeah, so here's what I would say about that. Let's say somebody comes up to me and they say, "I think I'm a nice guy. What do I need? What do I need to be, told otherwise?" And that should be enough for God. Here's my problem with that. We do have a mountain of evidence that describes that that's moral self-licensing. And we have a mountain of evidence that when you morally self-license, that I have some notes here. Let me see if I can pull up my notes on this, because there's some really interesting sociological evidence that shows that moral self-licensing almost always contributes to worsen moral transgressions of behavior.
I love this. I want to hear about this, Tavo.
Yeah,
I do. Yeah. You know why? Because I think this really gets to a major part of why I'm an atheist. It's a piece of it. I don't see any reason that I need to look to a God to tell me what's right or wrong. So you're cutting through some of the reasons I'm atheist. So
yeah, I mean that's helpful. There's a great study by Sakdeva in 2009. It's in Psychological Science. It's called "Sinning Saints and Saintly Sinners: The Paradox of Moral Self-Regulation." It's in my notes here that I happen to have right in front of me. So it's really interesting because he goes into a lot of detail on this, and there's a lot of mechanisms. But if you take somebody, you say, write an essay about how great you are, then their likelihood to do philanthropic things after they write that essay is going to be lower. Empirically, we've actually shown that in sociological studies. On the other hand, if you have somebody write a paper about how they're, the things that they've done wrong in their lives, and then you give them the opportunity to donate to charity, they're going to be more philanthropic. So there does seem to be a degree to which our moral behavior is determined by our degree of, kind of circumspective self-licensing rather than permissive high latitude self-licensing. And there's a lot of stuff that's been written about this. Browning wrote a book called Ordinary Men, and it was about Reserve Police Battalion 101. And this was a group of Germans who took a bunch of Polish Jews, who exterminated them. All good men, right? All looking at themselves saying, "I'm a good person." And Hannah Arendt, who's I referenced briefly earlier, who's a really great atheist, one of the most influential political science theorists of the last 100 years, made her career talking about the banality of evil, just talking about how evil doesn't come about because of the Adolf Hitlers of the world. Evil comes about because of people who say, "I'm a good person. There's nothing wrong with me." and yet they can be convinced to do huge moral transgressions. And then, of course, there's a lot of other examples from sociology. The Milgram experiments, right? You had people who were essentially electrocuting other people to the point of death. Now, those people who were getting electrocuted were just actors, but the people didn't know that. For all that they knew, they were delivering a terminal dose of electricity to somebody who for just getting a question wrong. Now, I think the people are probably good, but I think the jury is somewhat out on that. And I think if you look around human history and you say, I don't see any evidence that humans are bad creatures, I think that's a flawed perspective. So in that regard, I think the ethos of Christianity and saying, look, you're a flawed person, you need salvation. I think that makes us be more introspective. Now, I will fully admit that some people take Christianity and say, I'm Christian, and therefore I'm better than you, and I'm on a higher plane than you morally, and that potentiates their ability to really treat people in a way that's cruel, callous, and often really, really malignant. So I'm not saying that Christianity is absolute immunization from any kind of moral transgression, but I think that the perspective of Jesus really does make you have to say, look, I have to be more circumspect about me just saying, hey, I'm a nice guy, and therefore I don't really need any help to be nice. I think like I think every day about what can I do to be more kind to other people? What can I do to be less cruel? And every night I pray for the people that I've hurt in my life. And there's a lot of people, frankly. And I feel like doing that every night gives me more of a perspective of like, I think, oh, great, I'm a doctor, I'm helping people, I'm saving some lives. But when I think about it more pensively, really, I don't have any claim to be on any kind of moral high ground at all. And if anything, I'm probably worse than a lot of other people in the world. So I think that's the point. Now, I think the lesson of Christianity is prescient in that regard, because this is something that we've only begun to understand in perhaps the last 100 years or so, that humans are pretty morally flawed. And we are especially flawed, and we're especially immune to our own flaws when we say, you know what, I'm a pretty nice guy. I don't need God. I don't need forgiveness. I'm fine. Yeah.
Well, I definitely don't think everyone that thinks they're a nice guy is necessarily a nice guy. So so let's make,
Yeah,
understand.
absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, of course, there are people who think they're nice people and they're not nice people. I'm just talking about it from like a personal level of someone examining themselves. And some people might conclude, yeah, I mean, I'm not perfect, but I'm pretty good, right? Pretty good. On a scale of 1 to 10, I'm an 8. That type of mentality, right? And it seems like in Christianity, that's not good enough. It's just not good enough. So, like, if I'm a pretty good guy relative to my culture and relative to the life that I'm living, we have a God in Christianity that says that's not good enough. I mean, am I correct in that? Isn't that Christian theology? It's just not good enough.
Yeah, but I would endorse that. I would say that if God is telling you you're not good enough, I think that's solid doctrine there. I think that's
Well, it is Christian doctrine. You agree with that, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I reject that. So that's one of the reasons I would.
Well, I guess what's your basis for rejecting it, though? Because you think that for some people you're good enough, and that's really all that.
Well, I think that ultimately, I mean, I'm looking at this from my own perspective, right? And I could do good things, I could do bad things. I'm capable of both evil, and I'm capable of good. And I think most people are in that category, right? They could do good things and they could do bad things. And self-reflecting on that is an important thing, whether you're Christian or not Christian, right? Like when you said you reflect on that, that's great. That's great. All right. But you don't have to be a Christian to reflect on that. I mean, anybody could reflect on that. And I often do. All right. But I'm the one who's determining, this level of morality that I'm reaching. I'm not looking to an outside source to determine that for me. And I think that's a fundamental difference between, let's say, a Christian and a agnostic atheist like myself. I find that Christians are looking outside of themselves to be told, you know, this is good, this is bad, whereas I'm doing all that myself. So I think it's just a fundamental difference in perspective.
Yeah, and obviously, like, I think if the argument that you're saying is, look, I'm good enough that I don't need, I don't need to an external source to tell me what morality is.
Right.
I would lose that argument, okay, because I don't know you very well, and I'm sure for all you're saying, you are correct, and you're a very nice person. I'm just saying, when let's use Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative and let's universalize that maxim. Well, then you have the problem with this lake woebegone moralistic situation, which means that every person rates their own morality as above average, right? And it isn't, right? And we know from historical and sociological data, a mountain of it, that very ordinary, normal people who think they're good people do terrible things. My favorite religion, if I weren't Christian, is Jainism. I think it's a really beautiful religion. It's very, very pacifistic. But look at what it teaches. It teaches that you have to do no harm to the environment. You can't crush or hurt any living thing. If you do, it's a sin. I don't know that I would go that far, but I'm a vegetarian, and I look at the meat industry and I see people who say, like, yeah, I'm a perfectly nice guy, and yet they eat a cheeseburger from McDonald's that results in untold suffering around the world, and animals who become that meat have to suffer tremendously. And I say, are you really that good a person? If you look at the things that you're doing wrong, you're really contributing. Or they waste a lot of environmental resources, or they have money and they don't help other people. So I think the world would be better if we said, you know what, I am not the ultimate moral, and this is maybe not true for you. Maybe you're the exception in this regard. But I can say that I think the evidence is definitely on my side. That if I take your ethos and say, every person should say, I'm a good enough person. Every person should appeal to their own moral ruler for where they think they are, and their own internal moral evaluative criteria. And that's what they should use to determine whether they're good or bad. If I take that and universalize it to all of society, then I think you have a society where people are doing very bad things and justifying it because they think they're better than they actually are.
Well, I think that's taking something in a direction it doesn't need to go. Like I don't look at myself and think I have it all together and I'm, perfectly moral. But I want to be realistic with myself, right? I think that's important, to be realistic. All right. When you have a particular religion that you're following, you are going to an outside source to tell you. It's like I always say, morality, when you're religious, is dropped upon you, right? Whereas morality for the non-religious or the atheist is your morality. You're giving your own morality. You have your own morality. You could be an evil person. I mean, I recognize that. All right.
And you could
But
be an evil person, and
you
you think,
might not be an evil person. You might be a pretty good person. Right?
well, yeah, but I mean, sociologically, the world seems to be filled with people who think that they're pretty good people and are actually doing pretty terrible things to the environment.
I don't know. I mean, I meet
I mean, just look
people
look at the
that
Milgram
are both.
experiments. Yeah, I mean, well, look at the Milgram experiments, right? You had normal people, and by the way, this is the whole phenomenon of moral self-licensing, right? That people are, and in fact, people are very good moral arbiters of when an action is immoral. But several studies have shown that I think there was another study by Monin and Miller in 2001, and I forget what their study design was, but several studies have shown that the same action, when people see somebody else doing it versus themselves do it, they weigh it very, very differently. So, I mean, I don't, I see what you're saying. if you're, and I can't argue against it, if you're saying, look, I'm pretty much as, I'm the right, I'm the right writer of the evaluative criteria on which I should be judged. That may be true for you, but what I can tell you for sure is that is not true for most people, and we know it from the sociological literature. If we let people define their own morality on their own, then they create these moral scotomas, right? These moral blind spots for the ways that they transgress, and we know that from psychological literature, cognitive literature, and sociological observations. So, to me, I have no doubt that that if you tell somebody, this isn't really true, but I think if you take a population, you take 50% of the and this is very conjectural, okay, but I think if you take 50% of the population and you say you can do whatever you want, and you've been selected because you're all morally the highest, the highest people in the world, do whatever you want. I think you're going to end up with an emergent pattern of behavior that's going to be more immoral, that's going to be filled with more transgressions. And if you take the other 50% of the people and you say, look, God is judging you, God is watching you, and God has commanded you to be moral, I feel like there's a chance that there's at least some likelihood that they'll be more moral. I'll give you one more sociological experiment they did on kids. And that's not 100% true, and it's not true in a multifactorial way, but I think the sociological evidence points out to the fact that when you tell people you are the arbiter of morality and that you are morally good, that they tend to be more morally repugnant when you do that. Okay. I'll give you one more thought experiment. It's not really a thought experiment. They took a population of little kids and they said, you can steal this candy, right? And the kids did, right? And then they took another population of kids and they said, there's an invisible person who's sitting in this chair who's judging you, and they're going to judge you badly if you steal the candy. Then the rate of theft went way down. So I don't think that oversimplifies the pattern of moral behavior. But I definitely think that one of the problems that I have with secular humanism is that it creates this ethos that humans are at the apex of moral decision making, which I think we've shown time and time again. And let me give you one more thought experiment. Take any one person, and put them in charge of, put them in the status where they're the emperor of the nation, right? How many people do you think would be benign and just kind and giving in that setting versus how many people do you think would be malignant? From historical observations, I think we'd have to conclude that most people, given that amount of power over other people, will start to use that power in ways that are really malignant. So to me, one of the flaws with secular humanism is it's too anthropocentric, right? One of the flaws with moral self-licensing is it's wrong. If you let people judge their own morality, they're going to say they're way more moral than they are. And another problem is if you universalize that rule, then you end up sociologically with what we suggest is there's a body of evidence that you're going to end up with sociologically less moral behavior. Now, this doesn't apply to everyone across the board. I know people who are atheists who are much more moral than I am. I know people who are Christian who are less moral than I am. I happen to be surrounded right now with a lot of Christians who are very good people. But I think if you translate the ethics that we're talking about, putting somebody at the center of moral decision making on their own with no external check, I think you end up with a much uglier world.
Well, this is fundamentally a difference between how you would think and how I think. It's just a fundamental difference.
Well, I guess my question is this: do you think that way just for yourself, or do you think that way for the general world? Like, do you think most people are good and can write their own moral evaluative criteria, or do you think most people do need that sense of like morality isn't something that I get to decide for myself?
I think that most people are brought up to think they need someone telling them what is moral. So, if you grew up in a Christian environment, you're told that God has to tell you what is moral. All right. So, yes, I think that that's what we see for a majority of people, let's say in America. But I don't think that's true. I think that's because people have been indoctrinated to believe these things. I actually think it is more true that ultimately it is humans who decide what is right and wrong. And
Well,
I just go for the, like, I would say I'm looking for what is true. And in that sense, I see it as true that ultimately human beings decide what is right and wrong. And they do it twofold. All right. One is for themselves, because I would call that a personal morality, right? I think this is okay. I think that is bad. And that's personal. It's me. But then there's society. And society has a group morality. And that's so morality is both a group and an individual. Right. And to me, at the end of both of those is human beings. And that's just true to me. Like I can't relate to this concept that there's a God who's telling me what is right and wrong. It just,
and we're definitely not going that far. What I'm saying right now is there is a body of sociological evidence that suggests that if you leave humans to their own devices to determine what is moral, then you get worse patterns of behavior. And I think that's fairly well established in the sociological literature that I see in front of me when I research this topic. The more you go down the road of moral self-licensing, the more you permit people to do things that are bad. I think that's fairly uncontested in the sociological literature. But let me give you one more thought experiment to think about. Who is, let's say this, let's say that there's two different universes right next to each other, identical in each and every way. Okay. Which universe do you think has the better yardstick for whether or not individuals are behaving morally? Now, one universe looks exactly like our universe, okay, but there's no God. The other universe looks exactly like our universe, but there is a conscious entity that the universe has. So the universe itself is conscious, okay, and those are the only differences between the universe. In one, the universe is conscious, and the other universe is not. Who are the better arbiters of morality? Is it the individuals in the universe, in the hypothetical universe number one, where everyone is deciding for themselves what is moral behavior, or is the universe number two is the better yardstick in that universe, that the conscious entity that is the consciousness of the universe, is that entity, I should say, a better arbiter of the individual peoples and the morality of their actions?
it's very obviously hypothetical, right? I mean, we know that these, separate universes aren't necessarily real, right? But I just think that the universe that is created when you imagine there's a God telling people what's right and wrong is not actually a true universe. So it's like, it doesn't matter. I mean, it's like if people behave themselves because they're, under a authority who tells them they must behave themselves, that may very well be true. And that could be the way it's going to end up. But I don't think that's very free. And I don't think that's the highest form of morality, because I would say the highest form of morality is when a person makes the right choice based on themselves.
Now, this is something very, very different that you're talking about. You're talking about deontological versus teleological motivations for morality. Now, I'm actually there with you on that one. I think that's a very different thing. By the way, On Day 3 has got a really great channel, and thanks for reminding people. Hit the like button. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. If you don't know who I am, I think this has been a great conversation so far. But I think I'm happy to switch to the next topic. But the thing that I want to leave you with is this. You can say that you want people to behave morally because of the morality of those actions and not because of a reward or punishment that lies in wait for them. I actually agree with you very strongly there. I think morality is something that is deontologically that the best morality is deontological, right? The best intentions that you have and everything else. But I do think that there is unquestionably a sociological body of literature that suggests that when you leave people to their own devices and you say these people themselves can decide what is moral or what isn't, then you create a universe of moral self-licensing that churns out behavior that is more repugnant. And I would ask you to consider that the sociological data also points in that direction. And I want you to know this is not something I take lightly. I've really profoundly struggled with a lot of this stuff. By the way, if you haven't subscribed to On Day 3, please subscribe to their channel. It's really fantastic. It's a really great channel as well. So, and LA Apologetics, feel free to like tag people who are in the chat who you think have great channels. And LA Apologetics, if you want to, since you're a mod, please also, if you would, grab Brooklyn Lou's channel and put it in the chat, because he does have a great channel. And if you don't do that, if I don't see you doing that, I'll do it myself in a second too. But the point is this. I do think there's a sociological body of literature that say that when I take what you're saying and I universalize it to all people, then you get behaviors that are morally filled with more transgressions.
Well, here's the only thing I would push back on that with is my own studies years ago, not recently, but I remember studying people who are in prison, people who do crime. And if you looked at that as a data point, there's no indication that people who believe in God commit crime at any less of a rate than people who do not. So I took that as meaning it's good. There's good and bad in all people groups. Like let's say some people would say abortion is a moral issue, right? Christians do abortion at equally the rate as of an atheist. All right. When they look at these populations, Christians get a lot of abortions. All right. Crimes, prisons are mostly, and I understand that it's a situation where a lot of people in America are Christians. So a lot of Christians are committing a lot of crime. All right. I get that. It's per capita, right? It's not just looking at a raw number. But even when you break it down to per capita, I was not able to see where Christians were any more moral on a whole host of different issues that people would consider moral issues. So I wasn't persuaded that Christianity makes people moral in any way.
Well, what you're pointing at is a real argument made by a lot of atheists. Now, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to ignore what you said about abortion, because I just don't want to touch that issue, to be honest.
It's okay with me.
I think that's very challenging. So let's pretend that we glossed over that, because I will. But if you want to push me on any of this stuff, you're welcome.
I was just using it not to get into it, but just as a possible criteria that people would use,
Yeah, I think abortion is a particularly challenging issue. But all right, well, let's go back to the criteria, because that is a real argument and it's made by a lot of atheists. So it's probably worth spending some time on. So the argument is this: if we look at people who are in prison, we see most prisoners are Christian. Okay. That is a powerful argument. Okay. Now, here's the problem with the data, and this is just a problem. We actually don't know what people's religious beliefs were when they committed the crime. Okay. So we know that people who are in prison tend to generally identify more with Christianity. They are exposed to Christianity. I would argue that's actually a good thing. Okay. And the reason why is we have plenty of sociological data that shows that religious affiliation, if you're if you're a criminal, religious affiliation actually decreases recidivism. But if you look at the Bureau of Prisons' own statistics, okay, they actually show that people are Christian once they're in prison. If you look at prisoners who have been sentenced, then there's a higher incidence of Christianity. There's actually no data saying that people are Christian when they commit the crimes. Now, there are some people, and it's a startlingly high number of people who are really repugnant, people who are drug dealers who say, yeah, I've accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior. And I think that's challenging when you interact with those people. But there's actually no data showing that Christians commit crimes at higher rates than other people. The data just shows that after people have been arrested and sentenced, that they tend to identify more with Christianity. Now, I think
And
that could be
understand, Tavo, I want to make this clear. I wasn't, and I don't think that Christians commit crime higher rates when you consider the per capita aspect, you know. But I think
oh, sure, yeah.
I think it's an equal rate. So, you know, this idea that, you know, well, people who are Christians
Yeah.
somehow
No,
get a better morality, I don't see that as being what
no,
I
yeah,
would say.
now here's where the Bureau of Prisons information is really important, because they acknowledge with their instructions to chaplains that people who are in prison will sometimes erroneously self-identify as Christian to get benefits, to lighten their parole sentences, to get better, more favorable outcomes in parole hearings. And actually, if you're a prison chaplain, okay, so yeah, so the Zara makes this observation as well. They turn to Christianity in prison to reduce their sentences. Okay, and this is actually very well validated by the Bureau of Prisons' own instructions towards chaplains. They actually tell chaplains, like, people tend to identify as Christians when they're not. Try to be able to be aware that a lot of these people could be faking Christianity. So
Mhm.
that's the real problem. So I've heard the statistic before. I don't think it's persuasive. Now, are there any statistics that show that Christians are more moral than anybody else? I personally think that that's a really problematic thing to study. Okay. But I will say that there's at least some intriguing sociological data that I would encourage you to look into. One, Christians do donate to charities at higher incidences than the rest of the population, right? That part of morality, or is that they're just better donors, or they have more money? I don't know.
I
But
don't
if you
know
look
either.
across political parties, people who are Christian, who are regular church attenders especially, tend to donate to charity much more often. Now, are they just donating to Christian charities? Are they just favoring their own Christian causes? The answer is no. They donate more across the board to secular causes. So if you have a
Mhm.
population of atheists and a population of Christians, it's sociologically a totally clear, very, very well established conclusion that the Christians donate more to secular causes. Okay. So what about volunteerism? Are these people volunteering? Yes. So if Christians tend to volunteer more, again, that tendency towards volunteerism goes towards secular causes as well. Could we be conflating this with some other factors? Well, it so happens that people have studied this along the whole breadth of a wide political spectrum, and on both sides of the political spectrum, very conservative and very liberal, Christians donate more and volunteer more than atheists, no matter where you are on the political spectrum. So if you're very liberal and you look at very liberal Christians, they're doing more than their liberal atheistic counterparts, and the same is true of conservatives. So that to me doesn't show that Christians are more moral necessarily, but
Mhm.
it's at least an interesting sociological observation. Now, I think
And
people can be moral or they can be immoral, but I don't.
and I value what you're saying, but I think that you have to consider, like when looking at that, you know, there could be other reasons that's the case. Like right off the bat, I would say, well, yeah, the Christians, they have a better sense of community. All right. I think that's, you know, I could say that. Like, you know, the religious communities are driving a lot of charity. All right. So you got like, is there really an atheist community? I don't really think so. You know, not in that sense. And also, a lot of Christians give because they feel obligated to give, like they feel like God wants them to give, right? And yeah, that could be a factor. And the fact that they're giving, I'm all for it. It's good, you
Yeah.
know.
I will say this, that I think there would be more Christians if becoming Christian was an immunization against doing bad things to other people, right? If you said once you identify with Christianity, you're never going to be a jerk, you're always going to be nice to other people. I think if that's where you sit on the spectrum, that would be great. It doesn't happen that way. It doesn't work that way. I don't think there's, I'll just and let me give you my broader thoughts on this. There's no ideology that I think is a complete safeguard against immorality. I personally have found that the Christians that I'm surrounded with right now are very, very nice people. Um, And, I think the question of morality is very hard to answer, but I think there's at least some intriguing sociological observations. It would be great, and it would be much more clear evidence if you looked around in the world and you said all these Christians are all unequivocally way, way more moral than these atheists. That's very clear evidence. The evidence is not that clear. The evidence is clear that Christians do donate more to charity. They do volunteer more. They participate more in their communities across secular causes. So there's some intriguing evidence. Now, I will say this as well. Before Christianity came into the world, right, versus after Christianity came into the world, there was a powerfully transformative effect. Okay. Now, I think what's happened is some of the values have sort of seeped around and become more global. That I think that marginal incremental difference has been mitigated. But it's unquestionable to me that the sociological data supports that the advent of early Christianity resulted in changes in the Roman Empire specifically that we can actually look at and say that, yeah, society became more moral. In fact, that's one of the chief arguments Justin Martyr makes when he advocates for Christianity is, look at these people, they're all behaving way more morally. In fact, the very cruel practice of infant exposure was essentially eradicated because of Christian efforts. So I don't know that there's no data. If you're looking for it, it may be not as strong as some people would want it to be, but I think it's not nothing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I could accept that. There is data, right? Yeah. It's just when you're in my position or my skepticism, all right, I look at it like very deeply. I have to ask the next question. Well, why would that be? I mean, it's so I don't find like an argument from morality for Christianity to be persuasive. I've heard them, but I don't find them personally to be very convincing. I've been around the block. I'm 63. I've known Christians who are good, and I've known Christians who are very bad. And I would say the same thing is in the atheist community. There are atheists that are really good, and there's atheists that are really bad. So I just don't see a difference. Could I find some data that might suggest there's a difference? Probably, if I look hard enough.
Yeah, I would recommend keep looking at the data. Keep looking into like the differences in volunteerism, the differences in pro-social behaviors, the differences in philanthropy. But I would argue that, yeah, you're going to find people who are good and people who are bad. The real study, which no one has done, probably nobody can do, is you take one person, right, who's an atheist, and take exactly the same person and convert them to Christianity and see what happens to them over time, right? I think that's harder to do that study. Nobody would ever do it, but
I don't think we can do it.
That would be the only. I think that's the only way to settle the question conclusively. Yeah. But I think if you're saying as a population who is more moral, there's at least, I think, some intriguing sociological evidence for the philanthropy of Christians that is at least interesting from that perspective.
I'm not going to argue with that.
Let's keep going. Let's keep going.
You want me to ask another question? Or?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about two topics so far. One is sort of this whole moral self-licensing. The other is sort of, are people good or evil? And by the way, people in the chat can ask more questions too. So
if
you have questions that what you want me to pose to Brooklyn Lou, or if you have questions that you could pose to me. I guess Faith from Fact says an atheist who just became a Christian could try it. I guess I should speak to this since I'm actually in this category. There's no question about it that I'm a more moral person now being a Christian than being an atheist. But as an atheist, my view on morality was I was kind of an ethical emotivist, right? That I didn't believe in absolute morality. I don't know that that means that I was a bad person, but I don't think it's about labeling people as good or bad, but I definitely am now more, and it's not because God's going to reward me or God will punish me. It's definitely not that. It's just, I tend to think more universally now. I think about universal ethics.
Now, I'm going to answer that from my atheist perspective. And I think that's what this is all about, right? We got two perspectives.
Yeah.
In my perspective, my experience was the opposite of yours. I was Christian, became atheist, and I feel I'm a better person now and a more moral person now. So I think that whole thing could go either way, I guess.
Yeah. In what ways are you more moral now?
Oh, I feel I've become much more empathetic. All right. I've become much more concerned about the well-being of people around me. I feel what they're going, that's empathy, I guess. I feel what they're going through in a greater way. And I'd like to participate if I can in helping people in a greater way than I did when I was a Christian. So, and again, I know that's personal, and I know that's going to vary from person to person. But
Yeah, and I mean, I have a hard time even imagining you being unempathetic to other people. I feel like, we don't know each other very well, but I feel like if I called you and I said, Brooklyn Lou, I'm stuck, yeah, out in the middle of nowhere. Can you pick me up? Like I feel like you'd drive out and pick me up. Now I live in a different city, so you'd probably be like, let me order you an Uber. But I
get
feel
your
like you're a very
cab.
empathetic person. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But the thing is, yes, I mean, I'm not saying I was a bad person as a Christian. I didn't look at it like that, but the level of empathy I think has gone up because as a Christian, I guess I had a little bit of the Calvinist type theology, where God has selected certain people, all right, and there's an element to that made me a little colder, maybe, and I'm trying to describe it, Whereas now I truly feel humanity. I think I feel humanity more now.
Well, that's definitely problematic. Now, I don't believe in that sort of like predestined grace, and if that's what you're, and I
Yeah,
don't. I mean, I
I'm
feel like,
talking about that. Yeah.
yeah, that's problematic. I mean, I think that's just a problematic teaching. But I mean, there's a lot of different types of Christians, and I wouldn't necessarily agree with that ethic. If to be honest, I've struggled with this myself because let's say I die and go to hell. Would I really begrudge God for sending me to hell? I mean, the answer is no. I'd be like, thank you for giving me life. It was a really wonderful life. I'm really grateful. If it has to end now, that's you don't owe me eternal life. So I mean, I don't know. Like, I'm glad I'm not in a position where I get to judge myself or anyone else in terms of I'm the wrong person to judge anyone, especially anyone else for that matter. But yeah,
And we agree on that. We
yeah,
agree
yeah.
on a lot more than we disagree, Tavo. But yeah, there's major disagreements, but we also agree on a lot of things.
Yeah. And there's a lot of Christian viewpoints that are, I would argue, very harmful to a lot of people, right? And yet these get labeled as Christian viewpoints. And I hear you talking about those a lot on your channel, and I think they're legitimately flawed viewpoints. But to me, what is the core of what Jesus taught? There is a God, the universe has a creator, the universe has a purpose. You are loved, your life in this world is a gift, you know, but this world is not all there is. So don't focus too much on storing up your treasures in this world and trying to score the highest number of monetary points that you can. Like that's not what this is about. But but don't worry too much about tomorrow. Worry about today. Enjoy your life. Enjoy the life that you've been given. This world is good. It's a gift to you. There's beauty all around you, and appreciate that beauty and go about your lives while trying to love God as much as you can with all your heart, your soul, and all your mind, and try to love each other in the same way or better than you love yourselves. To me, that's a distillation, and that to me is what we are very clear that Jesus taught, and that to me is rather unimpugnable as a set of teachings.
Well, I think that I don't have any problem with that teaching. So, I mean,
Well,
it's not that I think a God made those teachings or did that because I'm atheist, so I don't believe a God did that. But I think that reflects good human teaching.
yeah, I mean, if that were my only evidence that hey, this is a really great teaching, I don't think that would be enough to change my mind for Christianity. I think, like I said, I have a lot of epistemic humility and calibrated uncertainty about my own beliefs. I'll say it this way. Do I think that there's a God in the universe? I'm about 50 or 55% sure that there is some entity that is probably we probably over anthropomorphize that entity, but I think there's some entity that doing some thinking or some feeling or some loving on the other side of this universe. Okay.
I
Um,
think when you said over anthropomorphized, I
anthropomorphize.
yeah, no, I know. I mean, I know the word, but sometimes my getting it out might falter. but
Oh, I just think we tend to think of God as in very personal human ways.
yeah,
Um, I don't, I meet a lot of atheists on this channel who are like, I hate God, and they'll say that, and to me, that's like saying, what, could you hate the sky? Can you hate the mountain? How do you like hate the universe? Right. So I feel like if there is a God, it's kind of like the best analogy for God would be what we understand of the universe, now that's not the same thing as panpsychism. It's just that's kind of a shorthand for a set of beliefs that I have. But I think my point is that we tend to anthropomorphize God too much. We think of God as a separate entity who's sitting there on a throne, telling us what to do and what not to do. I don't think it's that simple. All right. So that's
and
one
we
question.
agree on that too.
Yeah, yeah. So about 50 or 55%. So now I'm about 60 or maybe 65% sure that in some way this universe has a purpose and that we are part of that purpose. 60, 65%. Not definitely not 100%. Now I'm about 85%, maybe even 90% certain that if there is a religion that's true, that it's Christianity. And when I say Christianity, I mean very broadly. I think the historical case for Christianity is much stronger than the historical case for any other theological tradition.
Well, I mean, I don't have anything to say about that is other than, you're free to feel that way. And I think you definitely study these things. You're not just flippantly, throwing your view out there. You're being careful in analyzing what you actually think. And I'm all for that. I don't have any problem with people believing different things than I do at all.
Yeah, sure, sure. I guess the question is it really justified looking at the evidence? And that's what we're here to wade
Well,
through.
like when you said the universe having a purpose, right? I would side on the position of no, it doesn't have a purpose. Okay. So we would be on opposite sides of something like that.
Yeah, I mean, to me, what makes me think that again, I think if you just take that argument in a background, I'll even admit it's not that convincing in and of itself, which is why my calibrated uncertainty is somewhere around 60 or 65%. But I think if you combine it with the historical case for Christianity, then it's a more compelling constellation. Now, the two reasons that I would give for probably the universe has a purpose. One would be my kind of just a fine tuning argument. I think that this universe it seems to be special in a way that can't be explained by just randomness alone. And then the other argument that I have, and you've heard the fine tuning argument, we can
Yeah,
talk about
yeah,
it if
of
you want to.
course.
And then the other argument that really kind of moved the needle a little bit for me is that there does seem to be an event horizon of this universe. That event horizon seems to record everything about the universe in greater detail than what I would expect. In other words, I would expect that our actions in this world should be transient and then should disappear into chaos as soon as we finish living our lives. Now, I made a whole video about this, so if that's a weird argument, I understand that. But this came out of what's called the black hole theory wars, which was a decades-long not theological, cosmological debate between Leonard Susskind and Stephen Hawking about what happens when something falls into a black hole. But what came out of that debate was this is actually a true story. This is real physics. A revelation so shocking that it's now called the minus first law of thermodynamics because it's so powerful, and that law is the law of conservation of information. So written on the event horizon is all the information that our universe can possibly hold. So that information is out there. It's on the surface of the universe. So that means that even though we think of ourselves as beings that will fade into existence and that's the end of it, the information that we generate in this universe is preserved. There's that information is encoded onto the event horizon of our reality. Now, that's surprising to me because from an atheistic lens, I kind of took the universe to be a big forgetting void. There's just a big black empty void, and once we die, soon after that, everyone forgets that what our name was, and pretty soon after that, it's as though we never existed at all. Now, I was fine with that as an atheist. In fact, I was quite content. In fact, I was diagnosed with terminal malignancy some years ago, and there was no deathbed conversion for me. There's no foxhole kind of conversion. So, but when I encountered that information, that the information of our lives is somehow written permanently, indelibly, in the event horizon of the actual universe, that was something that it changed my beliefs. I realized that my actions might be more meaningful or more consequential, or that if there's a plan for me, it's part of what's encoded out there.
But you can go all the way down that road and not come to the Christian God.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I combine this with, the evidence, the historical and academic historiographical evidence for Christianity across traditions. Yeah.
I think that's called cumulative, right? You take this, and then cumulatively you've come to believe in Christianity.
Is that a cumulative case? I think there's sort of like it's more of a stepwise. In other words, like I was sort of an atheist, and then I became an agnostic, and then I sort of said I think there is a God, and then I started getting into the teachings of Jesus after that. So I think these were more separate steps for me, but I guess they inform each other a little bit. So.
Yeah, but you agree that taking that line of thinking that you just were, talking about, that doesn't necessarily lead someone to be Christian.
No, right? not in and of itself. I would agree with that. But let me put this to you another way. Of all the miracles that we have in the ancient world, all the miracle claims, I've looked at this in some detail. The evidence for the Christian miracles, separately or together, seems to be more weighty than the evidence for any other miracle claims. Now, that alone in and of itself doesn't really move the needle that much for me. Okay. But add to that also the fact that Jesus is unique in one other category, which is that he seems to be one of the few ancient figures who contributes to human intellectual legacy, intellectual story, even to this day, right? And the examples of that are numerous. And I talked about, it's interesting that the teachings of Jesus are cited in a way that's constructive, atheistic, and direct by several different disciplines: political sciences, philosophy, ethical studies, sociology, psychology, literature. It's fascinating to me that there's one figure who is resonant in so many fields. And if we look across the whole body of ancient figures, we don't really find other figures who fit into that category at all. So that's at least one interesting historical note about Jesus. And I've actually measured this somewhat quantitatively, not perfectly, but I've got some quantitative evidence around this.
And that's, that's an argument, but it's certainly not a proof. And it's
not a proof, no. But I think if you where it does become maybe something that you would call cumulative, is in addition to that one, and you could say that's an interesting idiosyncratic feature about Jesus, that he's relevant to so many different fields, that so many people that he's still contributing even across 2,000 years of other thoughts that have come and gone from the human intellectual landscape. Right? Add to that also, we also have this very interesting perspective that Jesus was also a historically interesting person in several regards. And like I said, one of the examples of that is that the miracle claims for Jesus seem to be stronger than any other ancient miracle claims that we have. And I've looked at several. I've looked at the Asclepius temple healing miracles that we have some records of. I've looked at Vespasian's miracle claims. There are 2 people that Vespasian healed. In other words, what I'm saying is there aren't a lot of other historical figures that have this same legacy of like they were walking around healing people, right? There's some ancient magicians, like there's Alexander of Bonoticus, who was debunked within his time, and there were other people. There's like some divine insights through oracles, but people knew that oracles could be right or wrong, and that some oracles, when they were wrong, they fell out of favor. So it wasn't like it was just their predictive abilities that was really more venerated than that individual. So to me, that kind of puts Jesus in an interesting category in a couple of ways. Now, add to that several other interesting features about Jesus. And I'll just give you a couple. Number one, Jesus is the only named person in canonical Jewish literature who could perform miracles without any authorization from God. Maybe the closest parallel to Jesus is maybe the priests in Pharaoh's temple who could like throw down their sticks and turn their sticks into snakes. Maybe another close parallel is the witch of Endor, who doesn't get an actual name, but she conjured up a spirit. Maybe she was conducting a seance or something. So, but we don't really have a lot of details about that. So to me, that's very interesting too. The Jews who knew Jesus the best, who would have had the most consequential motivations to repudiate Jesus, to negate him, actually end up sort of accidentally endorsing that Jesus was doing something very interesting. One more interesting historical fact I'll give you is the Jews were around for about 600 years, about 8 different regimes that tried to exterminate them, right? And definitely tried to convert them, right? So there were a bunch of kings who took over the Jews who said, I'm going to end Judaism. And they didn't have any success, not a bit of success, okay? And yet, all of a sudden, when Jesus came around, there's this mass exodus from the Jews, where maybe the biggest percentage-wise exodus of Jewish religious figures in history left traditional Judaism to form this proto-Christian movement. And I'll just give you one more. After the death of Jesus, in the Second Temple of Judaism, okay, they all said, and this doesn't come from Christian literature, this comes from Jewish literature. They all said that the presence of the Holy Spirit left the temple after the death of Jesus. The whole purpose of the temple was, the set of miracles around the Yom Kippur atonement rituals, and that was happening. And all those miracles around the Jewish atonement that the whole Second Temple was built for, those all stopped working all at once, all right after the death of Jesus. And then the Jews are left for 40 years without any presence of God in their temple until the temple was finally destroyed. Now, I think any one of those things you could rationalize a little bit and rationalize away. I think when you have all of them together and then you read the teachings of Jesus and you're actually like, wow, these are actually pretty good teachings. At least some of them are prescient. At least some of them are ahead of his time. Maybe it's not a slam dunk case, but I think as an atheist, it was kind of pointing me in a specific direction.
Well, let me comment on that. All right. Personally, there are things that Jesus said in the Bible that I think are wonderful. All right. There are things that I would agree with, that I think are things that could help people. All right. So that doesn't surprise me. All right. I wouldn't feel that because I'm saying that means that there's magic in the world. Okay. Because to me, there's a very big distinction between things that are helpful, things that maybe shape societies. And then that's all important when we look at history, right? That is important. But none of that makes me believe in magic. So when you say like the Holy Spirit went away from the temple, like in my world, that doesn't mean much to me. The Holy Spirit went away from the temple. Like, it's just magical thinking to me.
Yeah, well, I actually personally don't believe in magic, and I don't believe in anything supernatural. And I've had this conversation with a lot of Christians. My beliefs are that if you are God, right, then, and this works for any universe, but imagine if there's a person who creates a universe and they create all the laws of nature for that universe, and they're also omniscient in regards to that universe. They should never have to circumvent those laws to create any desired outcome, right? So in other words, let's say I say to God, okay, God, if you're real, put a sandwich outside my door. And then I open my door and there's a sandwich there. Well, if God really, and let's say I say, well, I can explain the way the sandwich got there. So that means that God didn't do it. Well, here's the problem is that that doesn't really prove anything because God is the architect of the laws of nature, even by like, and I'm not saying like, I'm not using any definition that suspends atheism. I'm just saying if there is a God, that's how God would work, So we shouldn't expect, and I think this cuts to the core of most of the problems with most of the apologetical arguments, right? Most apologists are going to say, there's no way to do this through the laws of nature, and therefore there must be a God. I actually disagree with that whole premise. If there is a God, we would expect that God to work precisely through the laws of nature and never have to circumvent those laws to produce any outcomes. So I don't believe in magic. I believe that everything that happens can probably be physically explained somehow through some real interaction that happens in the universe. There's some real laws, but I don't know that is an important conclusion to my theology one way or another.
And that's, I think, intellectually honest of you. So I think that's you're saying something that a lot of Christians wouldn't even say.
Well, at the same time, a lot of Christians do argue with me on that point. But at the same time, when I ask them, why is this point antithetical to Christianity in any way, they can't really provide a real reason. So, but all right, let's switch topics. Okay. I didn't see this actually. So Zara Gray says, anyone have any questions, please put them in the chat. You're welcome to ask those questions. We're at an hour and 40 minutes. So I'm happy to keep on going and I'm enjoying the conversation, but yeah. And then I think Modern Atheism popped into the channel. So just shout out to really fantastic. Brooklyn Lou, do you know Modern Atheism?
I certainly have seen him around for sure.
Yeah, fantastic.
I don't know if it's, I say him.
I'd be happy to email
male, female, him, her. I don't know that.
It's Juan. You guys should definitely be in touch with each other. Juan is really fantastic and he's a really great interlocutor. And Mega Bloodbath Debates said he should be trying to save all the Tavos out there. Mega Bloodbath Debates also has a really fantastic channel. There's a lot of really great channels that are represented in this chat. I'm super glad. And thank you very much.
Yes, I've seen Mega Bloodbath as well.
Yeah. Well, let's turn our attention to some other questions. Why don't you ask me some other questions that you think are challenging, difficult questions for a Christian to answer?
I got some tough ones. All right. This is one that picks up on the morality thing. Now, again, we didn't get into it enough to know what your position is on morality. And I'm not going to pretend I know all that because your positions are different than a lot of other Christians. So I hate putting people in a box when they haven't actually revealed their position, right? But judging by a lot of Christians that I speak with, right, their version of morality, it's one that accepts eternal punishment for finite crimes. So my question for you would be, is it morally good for any human being to suffer eternally?
Excuse me. I drank some water, went down the wrong pipe. I muted myself for a bit of that. So I hope no one got grossed out by that. Well, I've made a video about this, and I happen to be surrounded by Christians who don't believe that hell is eternal conscious torment. Mm-hmm. I actually can't find anything in the Bible that says that hell is eternal conscious torment. So,
well, it does say punishment. I remember that.
Yeah, but I mean, that's hard to argue against, right? If I get to the end of my life and God says, well, you got to be punished for all the bad things that you've done, if there is a God, then I can't really argue with that. But I happen to not know any. I happen to be. I don't know anyone, but I'm surrounded by Christians who believe that hell is not eternal conscious torment. In fact, one of them is maybe one of the most beautiful people I've ever met in my life. Is the person who's a friend of mine who's in the hospital right now. Her name's Janice. If anyone wants to pray for her, but she's like 94 years old, and she is steeped in traditional Christianity. She's been going to church her whole life, and she says, "Yeah, I don't believe that hell is eternal conscious torment. I've never believed that. None of my friends believe that. I don't know people who believe that." So I think it's you're right. I think maybe 40 or 50 years ago, I would have expected that every Christian would say, yes, hell is eternal conscious torment. When I read the Bible from a neutral scholarly lens, I don't see any analysis that says that hell is eternal conscious torment. I think the closest argument is there's something about a worm who feasts, who's never satiated. So it's like a worm that continuously feasts. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your conscious experience in that domain goes on forever. So, and Faith from Fact says, I'm an annihilationist personally. I think he means personally, not personality, with a universalist streak to it. I mean, some of my favorite Christians, like Soren Kierkegaard, Origen, are all people who believe that at the end of time, hell will be completely empty. Or that's actually almost a direct quote from Origen himself, who was one of the early guiding voices in the church, who said, "Yeah,
Yeah.
hell is not eternal conscious torment. At the end, when God's work is all done, hell is going to be empty." Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has eternal life with God. I think if you're a bad person, and if you have had subjective, I think I could see bad people where you die and you get some punishment for the bad things that you've done, and then you cease to exist after the end of that punishment period. I don't think that's unjust. Like, to me, if I go to heaven or get judged by God, and God says, you know what, I'm just gonna erase you from existence now after you're punished. Again, I would just say, well, you gave me life. I enjoyed my life. Every night I go out and I walk around for a couple hours and I look at the moon or trees or bushes or rabbits, and I'm always like, wow, there's so much beauty, and I just want to share that with people. So I certainly wouldn't be like, no, God, you owe me eternal existence alongside you. That's something you owe me. Like, I wouldn't say that. I would say, if it's your judgment that I die now, that I perish, then I understand that. Skepticus has a channel. It's really fantastic too. Brooklyn Lou, if you don't know Skepticus, that's another individual that you should
I
definitely.
do. I've seen videos, and
Yeah.
I saw you talking to him just yesterday, I think.
We did. We did. It was, I want to say the day before yesterday, but Skepticus and I had a really great chat. You know what I should probably do, Brooklyn Lou, is I have kind of a database that I'm growing of, like, Christians who I'm just kind of friends with, who are small content creators, and atheists who are, I think really good to have conversations with. And I should probably email you all to each other. So Skepticus is a really fantastic channel if you don't know their channel.
Yeah, I've definitely seen some videos for
And
sure.
LA Apologetics, if you want to put Skepticus's channel in the chat, please do that. If you want to put Brooklyn Lou's channel in the chat, please do that. And if you want to put Modern Atheism, please do that. And feel free to recommend that everyone logs into subscribes to those channels. I think that'd be really great.
Hey, Tavo, one follow up on that, because I want to make this clear. I understand you don't believe in that eternal torment forever type doctrine, right?
Yeah.
And that's fine. But you certainly recognize that a big portion of American Christians do believe that, right?
Yeah, but I think that the Christianity changed a lot in the last couple of 100 years, and at least for early Christians, this was a topic of debate. So I'm pasting your channel, Brooklyn Lou, by the way. So again, I didn't see it in the chat yet, but if you haven't already, there's the link. So please go to his channel and please subscribe to his channel. He's got really fantastic content, and if I think he has some of the most pointed, most nourishing questions that could be asked. But yeah, I would agree with that. But there's also, like, a very fundamentalist type of Christianity in the United States, and that wasn't always what Christianity was. So
Yeah.
you were talking earlier about biblical literalism. If you wanted to pick that up, like, I think that's another thing that we could talk about a little bit as well.
Well, being I got you in your own hot seat, let me ask you one that I'm curious about.
And while I'm at it, I'll do modern atheism next, but also Skepticus and I had a really great conversation. And here's his channel, and you should definitely subscribe to his channel as well. We're a
Um,
nice big growing community here, all of us. I feel like the conversations that we're having are really, really important and really, really nourishing. And this has not always been the case. We are at a time in history where you can click a button and have a conversation between a theist and a Christian who are being polite with each other and who are really digging deep on the issues. And I think that's really precious. So I would encourage you all to support each other's channels, check out each other's channels. And if you're part of my audience, please check out these channels of these atheists. Go ahead.
appreciate that. And it makes you a special sort of person to do that.
Or very, very like promotion-y. But okay, go ahead. Next question.
Do you happen to believe or feel that an all-powerful God, the Christian God in this case, would have to have a blood sacrifice to forgive sins? All right. I don't. All right. I think that concept is preposterous and ridiculous. And again, I don't want to put anything on you. So I'm just asking, do you believe that an all-powerful, loving God needs to sacrifice something or have something blood drawn or, blood dripping in order to forgive somebody?
Oh, this is a nice comment. I find you one of the most interesting people that even go on Christian King. That's what I heard from you. Oh, that's nice. Oh, that's really Chris Lucas. I appreciate that that comment. Very kind of you to say. I hope we have more conversations, Chris, as well. Yeah, good. And that was also a nice comment because it got me out of answering that question. Well done, Chris. No, I'm just kidding. No, I do have actually a fairly pointed answer to that question. And my question to you is this: the thing that you seem to find objectionable about that is that the shedding of blood happened, right? The death of Jesus, right? Why was that necessary?
And Old Testament, like not just Jesus, but animals,
Let's put the animal sacrifice issue aside for now, and let's talk about Jesus, because I think that's I think there's two different points that I want to make on that. So did God do anything to contribute to the death of Jesus? In other words, did the Jews, did he influence them to kill Jesus? Did he harden their hearts? Or the Romans, did he cajole them? Did he influence them?
I don't think he had to influence them, but he certainly allowed them to do what they did.
Well, but they did it, right? It was the Romans and the Christians. Depending on what you believe, some people say it was really the Romans more, some people say it was really the Jews more.
No, I think that they did it. Yeah.
Well, but I mean, is that God's fault then? I mean, right?
When you're the boss, I say yes. When you're the boss and you control all things and you allow something to happen, that is at least partially your responsibility, your accountability. So yeah, I think at least you can minimize it, but it's certainly if I'm allowing my son to be killed, and I'm saying that, well, he needs to be killed because of what you did. All right. I'm saying something. I can't minimize that to nothing. All right.
Did God say Jesus needs to be killed?
I certainly, yes. Yeah. I mean, biblically, yeah. He wanted.
I would argue that God never says Jesus needs to be killed. God never influenced the death of Jesus. Humans killed Jesus. It was humans who took his life. That's not that. Yeah. The blood is not on God's hand. It's on the hands of the humans who killed him.
So you think that? I mean, and I agree with that. So I'm not going to disagree with that. But you think that he has utterly no accountability in this, even though he could change that in a moment. He could have said, no, you're not going to kill my son.
I think he has as much responsibility as he has for any murder that occurs at the hands of a human.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I don't, but I would argue that there's a story in the Old Testament that suggests that a blood sacrifice is specifically not needed for the covenant, right? And that's the story of Abraham and Isaac, right? The covenant is made based on the sacrifice of Isaac. Abraham has the knife. He's ready to kill his son. He's ready to kill his firstborn. And God says, no, you don't need to do that. To me, that is a direct signpost to the time of Jesus, when I think that's God saying, like, look, you don't have to kill the son. So when I think the Jews could have opted to not kill Jesus, I think that's a choice that they made, or the Romans, the Jews and the Romans together, as you actually really say. But I think that's a choice that they made. And I see what you're saying. God could have intervened and said, even though this is the decision that you've made, I'm going to intercede and prevent this from happening. But I think if you're saying God is at fault for the blood sacrifice of Jesus, I think that's flawed, right? Because God, I think God sublimating the death of Jesus to an act of forgiveness is a different way to phrase it. I don't know that God sacrificed Jesus, or if there was a sacrifice, it was God, transfiguring and incarnating into human form, putting himself at the mercy of humans. I think that's the sacrifice. But
why would he have to do that? It doesn't make it easier. Like, the question is still, I think that's still there, Tavo.
I don't think so. I think that's a very different question. And here's why it's different. When humans create, video games, those are sometimes very immersive realities. And then we incarnate into those video games, right? So to me, it's perfectly logical that God would create the universe and then would incarnate into a human life and then give us some messages, like say, hey, God loves you. The creator of the universe loves you. There is a creator of the universe. There's a purpose to your existence, and all the other lovely messages that we talked about. But I think if you're like, it's God's fault for the fact that Jesus shed his blood on the cross, I would argue that's not the case. The humans killed Jesus. It wasn't God.
Yeah.
So I feel very strongly about that. I think,
I think I told you, I actually agree with you. Humans killed Jesus. No. All right. But there's a reason that humans killed Jesus, and it's biblical. All right. God required sacrifice. That's biblical. That's Bible. I mean, I'm not making that up.
Where does it say that God required the Jesus to die?
Okay, it comes from a history of the Old Testament where, you can't ignore the Old Testament. It's part of Christianity. So you have an Old Testament that God tells people in order to have their sins forgiven, they have to kill an animal. All right. Do you agree with that is what it says?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like animal sacrifice in the Old Testament. I just think that if you're that's a very different argument, and I like I said, we should parse that out and treat it separately.
Yeah, but
if your argument is like this Old Testament view is that this Old Testament practice is repugnant, they shouldn't have killed animals, I don't know that I have as strong an argument against that. But if your argument is, why did God need Jesus to die for us to be forgiven? Right. And I have a very strong argument, which is that humans killed Jesus.
Okay, so are you saying then, let me ask you this, and really dial in on it. Are you saying then that Jesus did not have to be killed in order for sins to be forgiven?
I think if the Jews had come up and the Romans and it said, we're going to be merciful, we're not going to kill you, I think that's a different hypothetical. I don't know what would have happened in that case, but yeah, I don't think God encouraged anyone to kill Jesus, and I don't think God was involved with that. And I understand your point. God, if God's omnipotent, then isn't there some blood on God's hands for any act of cruelty that humans do, since God created humans? I think that's if humans have free will, then we have to have a world of consequences. And I don't really believe in free will. I actually believe in moral agency, and I think that's a better term. But but I feel strongly that I don't know what would have happened in that case, and it's hard to conjecture on a weird hypothetical like that. But
it is a question that would come up, right, for someone who's really thinking deeply about it. I mean, it's a real question. If Jesus was not killed, did not suffer, did not bleed, would God still forgive people?
I think the answer is yes. And here's my analysis is, I just finished rereading the book of Psalms, and I'm starting to read the Old Testament in the biblical Hebrew. And I don't speak Hebrew, but my own background is an Afro-Asiatic language, Tamazight. So it's a language. There's some homology to Hebrew, so I can kind of sound out the words. But anyways, Psalms is a book about the infinite forgiveness of God. So I think that yeah, there would have been some forgiveness, some pathway to forgiveness if Jesus had not been killed. And I think reading the Bible from a very neutral scholarly standpoint, if I'm reading it as one cohesive story, which is maybe problematic in some regards, but I see the sacrifice of Isaac, which didn't result in his death, as a signpost that you don't need to actually take the life to have the covenant. So I have this conversation with Christians. What if Jesus had not died? And and Christians were like, some Christians say, well, he needed to die. I don't know. But
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
Not that I'm taking their position. I'm just saying that that's what I hear mostly.
And my argument against that is, God didn't entice anyone to kill Jesus. God didn't encourage anyone to kill Jesus. I think people killed Jesus. And let me put it to you this way. I hear a lot of atheists making the argument that the whole Jesus narrative is cruel because it's a blood sacrifice, etc. And I'm like, but wait a second. Humans killed Jesus. Why are you blaming God for that? Why are you blaming God for the death of Jesus? If you're upset that Jesus' blood needed to be shed, you should be upset that we humans killed Jesus. That's our fault. That was our decision. God didn't entice us to kill Jesus. He didn't incite us to kill Jesus. He didn't encourage us to kill Jesus. If you're upset that that's the narrative, then you should be upset that humans have the capacity to take life in such a cruel way.
Well, I don't use notes, and I'm not looking at the Bible, but I know there's a Bible verse that I was familiar with, right, that did say, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is Hebrews, and I'll just say that I'm generally kind of a big picture Christian, but I also think that some of that stuff is post hoc rationalization. So I think there are parts of the Bible that say, well, the death of Jesus resulted in this, right? It resulted in our ability to be forgiven. But I think that's sublimation of an act of cruelty, right? So in other words, taking the act of cruelty and making the best thing out of it that could be made out of it, Look, I think that's a very hard question that you're asking. I've had this conversation with a lot of Christians. Usually after a very long conversation, they kind of see where I'm going. And I've had this conversation with some atheists. And again, sometimes it's a very long conversation to get to this point. But I think that eventually they see where I'm going, that if your objection to the narrative, Kajek is somebody who calls onto the channel a lot, and we've had this conversation at great lengths. But his whole point when he came at me was, this is very cruel. Why did God need Jesus to die for human sacrifices to be forgiven? And I said, wait a second, where does it say that God said you should kill Jesus? I can understand that if God actually killed Isaac, right? And I can understand that if there's something in the Bible about the Jews' hearts were hardened, the Romans' hearts were hardened, so they didn't want to kill Jesus, but they did because God hardened their hearts. Then that would point me in the direction of God actually proactively doing something. But to me, humans killed Jesus. I'm not going to blame God for that, and that was an act of cruelty, and I would agree with that, So I just think that waters down the atheistic argument against it a little bit, but I still understand your argument.
It's just an argument of trying to understand. It's a sincere thing that I don't see. The whole thing of forgiving a person or you needing some sort of blood sacrifice is barbaric to me, right? So my thing is, you might not think it's necessary, and I have no problem with that, all right? But most Christians that I speak with would say, no, that's absolutely necessary. All right. And for those types, it doesn't make sense to me. I mean, what you're saying in essence here is that Jesus really didn't have to suffer. God, and really, in a way, that's good news for me, because I don't need to believe Jesus had to suffer, and God may choose to forgive me. So in a way, that's better news for me, right?
Yeah. I mean, I do believe that there's a lot of sacrifice in the Old Testament, but there are just as many passages that talk about God's infinite forgiveness. So it comes to a hard thing. And then you have the conflict of interest of the Bible, the Old Testament being written by the people who benefited from the sacrifices, which were the priests in the temple. So it gets very complicated at that point. But I think that, I can see the Christian side of this. I can see the atheistic side of this very clearly. I think it's a very persuasive argument. But I think the point that often gets dropped is humans did something cruel to Jesus.
I recognize that.
Yeah. One tuna salad says, "For the wages of sin is death." Now, I would agree with that, but again, I think in this case, what it means is if you sin, if your life is sinful, afterwards, if you're judged by God, that's it. You're erased from existence. You don't get eternal life. Good question, though, Brooklyn. All right, let's do a couple more hard questions, and then I don't want to keep you on too much longer.
Yeah,
It's been 2 hours.
For fun, let's make it clear you did want hard questions, right?
I did want hard questions, and you're holding my feet to the fire. And I don't think if you come away from this conversation with saying that, oh, this is more nuanced, then I think that's good. If you come away from this conversation saying these aren't really Christian answers, I would push against that, because I really think most of what I'm saying is if not there, there may be one passage here or there that grates against some of what I'm saying or some of the implications. But I think I'm giving you answers that are based on a very neutral, objective reading of the relevant scriptural resources.
Okay, but this is something that it doesn't, you understand, a person's theology doesn't matter to me. I have no problem with what you're saying. All right. But you recognize that you're not giving answers to a question like that would be considered Orthodox Christianity. That you're giving an answer that many Christians would say is heretical.
Well, and again, I think I'm accurately citing the relevant scriptural resources.
Yeah, and understand, Tavo, I'm not going to hold it against you that you're a heretic.
Yeah. Well, here's my point. There's a lot of different opinions on a lot of these questions, but I guess my overarching point is, I think that the moral consequences of our decisions should be more carefully considered. And while I really appreciate your viewpoint, and I think it's very persuasive and very cogent, very cohesive, and really quite compelling, I worry that it and this isn't like my intellectual disagreement. This is not a personal thing, but I do think that there's a degree to which people need to be reminded that they are not the best arbiters of what is moral and what isn't. And that's my overarching argument.
Well, on that overarching argument, if a person isn't the best arbiter of right and wrong, and if a society isn't the best arbiter of right and wrong, what would be the best arbiter of what's right and wrong?
The only perfect arbiter of morality, I think, is an omniscient entity. That's not to say that proves that one exists. I think that that's the only yardstick, that you have to know everyone's motivations and you have to know everyone's actions, really, and all the consequences, mind you.
Now, if there is such a being, and obviously you think there is, but that person, do you believe that's a person, or do you believe that's not a person?
Well, I think Boethius was the one who defined person as an individual being with thinking and rationality and decision making. So if you're using a very broad definition of person, I don't know. I don't know, honestly. I don't know. That's the
Well,
best answer to that question is I don't really know.
well, if there's such a, you know, don't even call it a person, but a being of some sort, a force of some sort that is making these moral declarations, when they do that, that's entirely subjective. Is that correct?
Like I said, as an atheist, I was more of an ethical emotivist. So I didn't think that ethics were a real thing. And I still don't know how I feel about that. Now, I don't know what the definition is of right or wrong. I feel like an omniscient entity would do a better job of that. I do feel like there's an overall principle of moral rectitude, which is harmonious or disharmonious with the entities around us. And I think the best way to look at that is universal, right? So if I'm nice to everyone and everyone thinks I'm a nice guy, and then I go sit on my back porch and I shoot at the poor bunny rabbits with like a pellet gun or something, am I still a nice guy? I think, you could argue that I think I'm a nice guy. You could argue that everyone else thinks I'm a nice guy. Society thinks I'm nice, but I'm still doing something that's really cruel that just seems in a way disharmonious. I don't know that I have a good definition of what is right or what is wrong. I think maybe just sort of harmonious with other entities around me is maybe the best answer, but even that's pretty flawed and difficult.
Yeah, but I'm being very pointed because you want tough stuff, right?
Tough stuff. Bring it. Yeah,
So
bring it.
this is tough to me. All right.
Yeah.
And I'm asking it because I think it is tough. But pointedly, given that there may be a force, an entity, a person, whatever you want to call God, all right, that is telling us what right or wrong is, that is utterly subjective to that force or entity. Is that correct?
I don't. I see what you're getting at now. Let me see if there's a good way to answer this question.
You get the question though, right?
Yeah, but what if that force or entity is a part of us, a part of every living thing, a part of every entity that experiences the consequences of our actions? Would you still say that's subjective?
Yeah, because it's coming from some sort of entity, no matter how you want to define that entity. And a mind, the entity that apparently has a mind, has thoughts. All right. So that mind, when that mind is thinking, that must be by definition subjective to that person. And I get pushback on that from Christians all the time who says, no, God's morality is perfect. It's objective. It's, and maybe it is perfect, but it's not at all objective. It's definitely coming from his mind or its mind.
I
And
see what you're saying. If there is a separate mind that controls the universe,
yes,
that is within one mind.
yes. And when a mind has a thought and declares it, that is by definition subjective.
Wow, that's a really hard question. That is a really, really hard one. I would say let's define subjective and objective. Okay. So subjective is the conclusion of one mind, right? And objective is something that all minds would agree on, right? That's an imperfect definition, but if you use that definition, then the goodness of God is an objective goodness. What did I say?
It has to be.
What did I say from Dr. Kurt said? That's what she said. I don't know what I said. One of us must have said something that, yeah.
When a mind thinks a thought, I mean, tell me if I'm making a mistake.
What if that mind encompasses?
When a mind thinks a thought, it is subjective.
Well, okay. How about this? What if I said, oh, that's a really hard one. let me just say one more thing about Dr. Kurt, which is this is Dr. Kurt. He doesn't really have a lot of presence on YouTube, but he goes on to Mega Bloodbath Debates a lot, and he's really fantastic. And he's got a Substack devoted to a lot of my arguments, and he's written a lot of articles about a lot of my videos. So they're all really wonderful, and I learned something from all of them, and they're all really like holding my feet to the fire. So
Yes.
check out his Substack. It's substack.com/ekurtallen. All right. So yeah, I see what you're saying. But I guess my point is, there's at least, if you have more minds making the decision, that seems to be like it is more in the direction of objectivity, right? And if you have all minds making a decision, that should ideally be perfectly objective.
Yeah,
If you
but
have
we know
all-
that's not the case with morality.
how so?
We totally know for a fact that people have different views on moral issues. So all minds do not agree.
That's true, but what if we had a poly mind that was comprised as the composite of every mind? Would that still be subjective if that poly mind came to a conclusion? No, I'm asking legitimately. I don't know.
Yeah, no, legitimately, I think, yeah, I still think it would be subjective. But
I mean, Samian says objectivity is mind independent.
Yeah, I don't. Now, I really,
I mean, I would
I
argue,
don't understand how that's possible.
I would argue against this. Okay, and here's why I would argue against this: is by definition, subjectivity means from a specific perspective, right?
Yes.
If you have all perspectives incorporated, right, then that should be something that's more objective. And maybe subjective or objective aren't the best. Maybe objective implies that there's a perfect yardstick that's external to any mind, right? And if that's what you're saying, is the morality of God external to any mind? That's a question I don't know the answer to. But I do. Right. I would say that if God is the summation of every mind, mine, yours, the external mind of the universe, the consciousness of the universe, the bunny rabbits that I'm hurting on my back. I would never do that to any bunny rabbits, by the way. I want to clarify. I really love the bunny rabbits. They're very cute. That was just an immoral example. So, but I would argue that if that's the case, then at the very least, a poly mind that is the composite of all minds would tend towards less subjectivity and more objectivity.
Well,
I don't know if that really answers your question, but
from Samian 27, I understand what he's saying. Objectivity is independent of mind. I agree with that. But that's not Christian morality. Christian morality is very much dependent on a mind. Right? I mean, using these classic definitions of these words. So Christian morality is subjective. That's my point.
How about this? I think if you take all the minds in the universe, right, and all together, and the infinite information in the universe, or nearly infinite information in the universe, and you develop a conclusion based on that, that ought to be an objective conclusion within the universe. Now, if there's a different parallel universe with a different poly mind, and that disagrees with the poly mind of the first universe, then it becomes subjective with respect to the external universe. But if all we have is our universe and the reality of the divine plane or God, and we sum all that together, then a conclusion based on all that, mindness or all that compute or all that consciousness should be an objectively true conclusion. But I think what you're asking is a really hard question. And if your argument is, hey, I can't prove that there's not subjectivity in the mind of God and morality, I would have to stipulate that you're correct in that argument. I just think that, to me, the whole problem with subjective versus objective is the indictment of subjectivity. Subjectivity is not always an indictment. But the indictment here is that subjectivity is a fractionated, narrow perception of a pie slice of what reality really is, right? That's the usual indictment. And if you have a universal mind or a God mind, then that should take into mind, no pun intended, the whole pie itself.
Well, there's an argument there of making an exception for the God. You know, what applies to humanity, where we can say, you know, if you have a thought about morality, that's entirely subjective because we know that it's your thoughts and it's
Sure, sure.
coming from you,
I
right?
agree
But
with
we're
that. Yeah.
making an exception and saying, no, well, God doesn't work that way. When God makes these decisions, he's entirely objective. But that doesn't really hold up to common sense. I mean, the thing is,
Well, do you understand my pie analogy though? Because I think that's where it gets rationalized. It's not just one slice of the pie anymore; it's the whole pie.
yeah, you're having a concept of God,
Yeah. Well, let me give you one
but
other.
a concept of God is subjective.
You mean my concept of God is
Of
subjective?
course,
Oh, absolutely. I would agree with that. Yeah,
my
that's.
concept of a God would be subjective as well.
Well, I would agree with that. Yeah, yeah. I see what you're saying. I agree with you insofar as that. Like I said, if the moral yardstick is harmony versus disharmony with the universe around me and the universe of conscious entity around me, then I think, argue that God is a better objective perceiver of that. And maybe you would argue that there's still some subjectivity because there's humans in the world and that aren't part of God. That maybe that there's, that fractionates off a percentage of that and then makes the God more subjective and less objective. I don't know that that's a. I see what you're saying. If you really want to be scrupulous, that objectivity involves every decision making apparatus in the universe. Well, I think actually that we're still in the mindset of God being able to reach some objective decision in that regard.
Well,
I think this is a hard question.
the argument is a form of the you. Here's my mouth's going to fail me again. Urethro dilemma.
Oh yeah, that's a hard one. Yeah,
But
yeah,
I'm saying that the argument the question I asked is kind of a form of that.
yeah. I mean, and we could talk about that dilemma specifically. And I see where you're going by the fact that you gave me the analogy. If you want, you can talk about the Erythro dilemma.
No, no,
Um,
I'm saying just for your own information, you know,
yeah,
it's not exactly, but it's bringing it to morality, right?
yeah. And I think I can be saved from that by my definition of morality. That if we define moral goodness or moral badness as harmony versus disharmony with the universe and the entities around me, then you could argue that more aligned with harmony is good, more disaligned is bad, and that there's some objectivity of that, and that if you the entity of God includes all of that universe around me as well as whatever divine realm that there is, then you have something that is more resistant to humans shading things in terms of good or bad. I have a really hard time with the whole objectivity or subjectivity debate, and somebody wanted to debate me about this, and I'm still trying to figure out a good angle on that because, like I said, as an atheist, I was an ethical emotivist. I don't know that ethical things exist, but I think that there is an indictment of subjectivity because it's a fractionated perception of reality, and that's I think is the larger overarching point, and that if there is an omniscient being, then by that yardstick, by that definition of subjectivity, the omniscient being should be perfectly objective in that regard because it's not separate; it encompasses all minds, all entities, all information, all decision making apparatuses that are possible.
Well, I mean, I see morality of God being completely subjective. And I see that when I see things like in the Bible where God orders people to destroy children. All right.
Well, no,
This is something,
that's totally different. That's a totally different thing. I think.
well, we would generally say, no, that's not a good thing. But if God says it, it kind of becomes a good thing. And that's kind of the core of what I'm poking at. I mean, it's God is the one who's determining right and wrong, all right, and if he is determining right and wrong is entirely subjective upon his mind. What he decides is right, and what he decides is wrong. And they can be at different times in history. He might say, well, now is a time it's good to kill the children. And he might say at another time, no, now is not a good time. Right? So it's subjective on whatever God decides in that way.
Yeah. I mean, I see what you're saying. I mean, I think the conversation of why did God say that children had to be killed in the Old Testament is a different conversation than the theoretical conversation over whether or not a universal or omni-universal or omniversal mind can be subjective or objective. I think those are different questions. I would agree with you that that it's morally problematic for God to order the killing of children. You know,
Yeah, I agree with you.
The Old Testament is written in a very brutal time, and there's some brutality that's reflected in it. I don't know that that's an indictment of the Old Testament necessarily, and here's why. If you look at Shakespeare, and I went on Reddit recently, and I said, give me every passage in the Bible that you think is flawed. Okay, and on Reddit there were about 300 comments, right? Saying, many of them pointing to the same passages. So it was an interesting exercise. When I wrote down all the passages and I added them all together, that was still a fraction of 0.1% of all the words in the Bible. So here's my point. If you collect the works of Shakespeare, I can point out hundreds of phrases, sentences that are literally just kind of poor, sloppy, badly written, right? Now, if you say, well, you got a few sentences in Shakespeare that are really awful, right? Then you would still consider that Shakespeare is a really great work, right? Now, if your argument is literally every word of the Bible is literal truth and divine perfection, then I think it becomes a much more tenuous argument to make. But I would never make that claim.
I mean, I agree.
Yeah. Well, let me put it to you this way, Brooklyn Luke, because we're touching on a lot of different issues here. So I think we've left that sort of moral conundrum, and we've now engaged in a different question, which is, are the Old Testament problems that exist in the Old Testament flaws, and should they make us think differently about the scriptures in general? Like I've said in the past, I think Jesus is a distiller, right? Jesus says there's basically two commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind, and love each other, right? So everything else hangs off these two commandments, right? I think if there's anything proscriptive in the Bible that says, and in rabbinical tradition, some of these things in the Old Testament are treated proscriptively, and that's definitely problematic, right? You should kill these people. If we could identify Amalekites right now, we should kill them, right? That is a teaching that some people will put out there. I think that's a very, very flawed teaching. It's a dangerous one. Now, I feel like I should point out that a lot of this fundamentalism and a literal and verbal and plenary interpretation of the relevant scriptural resources came about in very recent history. In other words, before the time of Jesus, you had Philo of Alexandria, who argued that many things in the Old Testament are allegorical and have allegorical meanings. And Origen tackled that very phrase in the Old Testament and that very passage. And his point was, look, this is not meant to be something that we should literally do right now. We shouldn't go out and kill children right now. His point was the message that that God is saying there in the Old Testament is that, look, you have to when God says to do something, you can't take some of that evilness and use it for yourself and save it for yourself. And so really that's the message here. Now, I think that's an interesting take on that. I don't know that that totally resolves the fact that the Old Testament was written in a much more brutal time and there are realities that are represented there. But I will say that you have to be mindful of the fact that our interpretation of the Old Testament and scriptural resources has changed. And this verbal and plenary literal interpretation is a very, very recent development. I'll just give you a couple of examples. The Niagara Creed, right, came about in I think the 1890s. Now, this was a creed that didn't come about organically or from any grassroots movement. It came about because Milton and Lyman Stewart were these two brothers who were oil tycoons who poured essentially $300 million in current US dollars, a massive, massive amount of money, into promoting a very, very fundamentalist view of Christianity that gave rise to this verbal and plenary inspiration school of thought, which meant you had to take every word and every part of the Bible in a very literal way. Now, this also culminated further in the 1979 Statement of Biblical Inerrancy, was the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy. So my point is this: the fact that those statements had to be made meant that it wasn't always that way. Now, in the United States, we definitely live in a milieu where the Bible is a very literally interpreted document, but that doesn't mean that that's the correct Christian way to interpret it. That's a fairly recent invention. Now, Martin Luther was like sort of tending to, and John Calvin were tending to like, oh, we should be more literal in our interpretation. But Philo of Alexandria, Augustine, Augustine of Hippo, and several other individuals who were early on in tradition did say, look, some of this stuff is allegorical. You're not meant to take it literally. I just think that's an important complexion that I think changes the debate at least a little.
Totally changes the perspective.
Yeah.
And I recognize that.
And I don't think that makes things less Christian. I think it just contextualizes what our current viewpoint is, living in a nation that's largely influenced by Christian fundamentalism.
Yeah. I mean, and I agree with that. And I don't, I mean, the issue is like above and beyond that, all right, because we can agree on that, all right, is men, and today women, but throughout most of history, it was men, right? Men have decided what these doctrines should be. All right. Origen was a heretic, considered a heretic, wasn't he?
I don't know that he was considered a heretic. He was not a canonical saint. He wasn't canonized by the Catholic Church because of his ideas on universalism.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Universalism is considered heretical by a big portion of Christianity.
Yeah. I mean, there's many Christians who would say that universalism is not the way to go, that hell has to be eternal conscious torment. But but just because it's a majority of Christians doesn't necessarily mean that it is the correct viewpoint.
Oh, I totally
I might feel differently if there was a passage in the Bible that said, look, if you're bad, you go to hell and you suffer unimaginably and eternally. And I think the Quran does actually say that, but I don't know that the Bible says that. And using very neutral reading, I don't think there's anything that I could do to find that.
And we agree on that too, Tavo.
Yeah. Oh yeah. We're very aligned on
at the same time, as much as we can agree on certain things, all right, it's like there's a major portion of Christianity that is on the other side. See, Christianity is very diverse. Okay. So even when I'm talking to a Christian, it's like I really got to ask questions. What do you mean when you say this? Right? Yeah. Because there's no, it, to me, what I said in the beginning of our conversation, it seems to have humanity all over it. All right. It's human. I mean, this Bible is human. It's not magical. It's human.
Well, like I said, I think I would argue against that for all the reasons that I gave earlier on.
I mean, does it have superpowers?
I mean, I think in some regards, people are inspired by the Bible in ways that maybe is not magical. But again, I don't really believe in magic. But if you're saying there's nothing magical about the Bible, I would agree with that. I don't know that there's any magic there.
It's human. Would you go that far? Right? You go, no, it's divine.
I'm saying I don't know that
it's human.
I don't know that it's a dichotomy. I mean, I think there's passages that can't be interpreted literally. I think the New Testament is is something that does represent a literal narrative of historical events. I mean, here's my point. There's a lot of pluralism in Christianity, but if you want a religion that has less pluralism, Islam is a very, very unified religion, much more unified, less internal tensions, less different voices, less diversity of opinion. But to me, that's not necessarily a measure of is it better, and that's also not a measure of is it more likely to be truthful, right? So, I'm happy to say yes. There's a bunch of different viewpoints in Christianity, but to me, if I see three people who disagree on everything else, right? But they all say that this I should watch this movie. It's the best movie they've all ever seen. That to me is a more striking endorsement than three people who agree on lockstep on everything and they say this movie is the best movie. You should see it. To me, the plurality of opinions is more of an endorsement for the things where there is consensus.
Well, I agree with you on a lot of this.
Dr. Kurt's right. Islam has sex as well, and it also is portrayed more monolithic than it actually is. So,
yeah. I mean, I've talked to
Socialite podcast says, "Bless you, hun." I'm not sure if that's directed at me or you, but bless us both, I would say. I'm probably going to be out of time in about 5 or 10 minutes.
Sure, but, and we've been on for a long time.
We've been on 2.5 hours. Yeah, this is a long time. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, I feel a lot of empathy for the viewpoints that you express consternation with. Okay, because you've had a lot of negative experiences personally. You've interacted with people who have told you don't think, don't ask questions. I think that's very harmful. That's really would grate against somebody. And my biggest wish for you is, I mean, look, somebody got me a copy of the New Testament. And like I told you, I read the Quran at an early age. I read the Guru Granth Sahib, loved it. I love that book. It's Sikhism, right? I loved it. I read the Kitab-i-Aqdas of Baha'i, loved that. I didn't read all of the Pali canon, but I read the Bhagavad Gita, right? And I read many works about Buddhism, and I've read many other works. So, and I really loved all of them. And then somebody got me a copy of the New Testament, and I didn't read it. And I was like, I basically know this story, so I don't need to read it, right? So I moved away, and I left that copy behind, and my roommate brought it back to me. He was like, oh, you forgot this behind. Here it is. It's got your name on it. So, okay. And then this happened again. I moved away, left some stuff behind. Somebody brought me the Bible, and they were Christian, and they said, look, it would really mean a lot to me if you read this. And I read it, and I got to the point where I was like, you know what? Seeing this through fresh eyes, it's not what I've heard all my life. It's different, and it is more nourishing and more enriching. And I think, I'll be honest with you, Jesus Christ is what I would say when I stubbed my toe for my whole life. It is not something that is theologically impactful to me. It's not something important to me. But for some reason, I was reading the New Testament with a fresh set of eyes. And then I started looking into some of the history of it. And I was like, it didn't come from an era where people were seeing people rise from the dead all the time. It didn't come from an era with a lot of miracle claims. There's some, they're mostly after Jesus, but there's certainly not a lot of miracle claims from that era, and the miracle claims that we have from that era aren't widely, attested by anyone. And then we have Jesus, who has all of these good beliefs, who's the object of veneration from some of the greatest atheistic thinkers in history. Even Friedrich Nietzsche expressed admiration for the teachings of Jesus. He was a staunch atheist, and one of my favorite statements by Nietzsche was, "There was really only ever one Christian, and he died on the cross." And so I was like, "There's this one person who's an ancient teacher, who is the subject of a very interesting historical narrative, who also has these great teachings. And now I'm reading the New Testament, and I really do like these teachings. And now I'm seeing Jesus all of a sudden through a fresh set of eyes." It's a very hard thing to do, because I think it's even hard for Christians to do, because, we're also steeped in hearing about Jesus every day, that it kind of like, it gives us an ego phenomenon where our eyes glaze over. Ego, E-G-O, eyes glaze over. So, and that's how I was. My whole life, people were telling me about Jesus. And I was like, yeah, I know Jesus. Yeah, I know. I've heard the spiel. I've heard the sales pitch. And I just happened to be in a situation where I was seeing Jesus through a fresh set of eyes, and it did change my perspective, because I agree with you. If you go with what people who are Christian say and do, it's not necessarily a reflection of that. And I think you were exposed to a lot of the more, negative aspects of that. Anyways, all right. Well, I want to turn it over to you for some closing statements, and then maybe I'll give one last closing statement. But go ahead, Brooklyn Lou.
I I don't really, like I said, I don't prepare for this stuff, but I will say thank you because I think we had a very interesting conversation. I think it's valuable no matter what side of this you fall on, you know, and your type of Christianity to me makes more sense than the fundamentalist version that I mostly hear. All right. So, you know, I, I don't I don't think you're problematic in your Christianity. I think fundamentalism can be problematic, whether that's coming from Islam or Christianity or Judaism, right? I mean, just when you go overly fundamental on these things, it can become problematic. And I think you have a healthy version of Christianity. So, I mean, it was a pleasure talking to you. I hope that I made you think. I hope that, you know, I believe that when you think about things, it's always a positive. It's always good. So I hope I made you think a little bit.
Yeah, and what I'll do is I'm going to email you right after this conversation ends, and you'll have a link so that you can share this video on your channel. So it'll add your channel as a collaborator if you want.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. I'm definitely gonna watch it because we're just talking, obviously.
Yeah, yeah.
But I gotta watch it again myself because we covered a lot of stuff, right?
In the words of paraphrasing Brooklyn Lou, we're talking here.
Yes, we're talking.
That was my worst possible New York accent.
Yeah.
And by the way, on day 3's got a great channel. What I'm going to try to do, if it's okay, is if you're watching this video back, I'm going to tag Brooklyn Lou as a collaborator. So you should definitely go check out his channel. And I'm also going to go through the chat, and I'm going to add tags for all the people who chimed in, because I do feel like, Brooklyn Lou, there's two outcomes of this conversation. One is that we just both had a nice conversation. There's a much more meaningful outcome that I think is possible. And it's maybe not, as earth shaking as one of us changing our theological beliefs, but I think there's a really good outcome that we can have, which is look at all these people who, I'll put this quote on the screen from on day 3. Look at all these people who are talking to each other now. They're having conversations with each other. And these are some smart people. On day 3 is way smarter, a way better theological resource than I am. TNC Apologetics joined in. There's a lot of good folks. Modern Atheism. These people all deserve your subscription, and this isn't just the people who I'm talking to; it's people who are watching later. So I will tag as many people as I can think to tag. I think if you think about it, what an amazing impact this conversation could have if you all start talking to each other more. I think then it becomes about relationships that are being created. And I think that's way more impactful than anything that we've said really here. So,
And
but
and
boy,
that's what we agree on.
yeah. Well, let me ask you one last question. Do you have any content coming up that we should tell people about?
Yeah, tomorrow.
What you got? Tell us
At
more about it.
tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Now, I don't make really long stuff. I mean, this is like extremely long to me, right? But I have a video that I did. It's going to be talking about Alan Parr and what I consider an illogical argument that he makes, which goes into once saved, always saved.
What we could collaborate on, Brooklyn. Well, I'll email you about some collaborations as well, because we could collaborate on a lot of things. I think one other fun thing it would be to do is do a video where you and I both talk about some of the malignant, big church, people who are out there spreading things that are really horrific ideologies that are fleecing the blue collar class that they're ostensibly intending to serve. So we could talk more about that as well. All right. Well, I've got some content coming out too, but I'm really looking forward to Thanks very much on day 3, and thanks very much TNC Apologetics. Great channels, and I hope you all keep talking about that. And Zara, thank you for moderating as well. Thanks to everyone who's chimed in with really wonderful questions. Brooklyn Lou, this has been so enjoyable. It's been 2.5. It doesn't feel like 2 hours and 45 minutes. I could keep talking to you forever. And let's do this again sometime. I mean this very genuinely. This was so enjoyable, and I would sincerely be happy to do this absolutely anytime. Well, that's it for now. If you haven't already, click the like button on this video. If you haven't already done it, I've been promoting a lot of people, but please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And I really hope that you all have a really wonderful day.
Thank you.